Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Colorado. We are populating the Zoom call for the 7th day of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission rulemaking around mission change. So we're going to give folks a chance to get into the house, and then we will get started. So we're going to wait about a minute and let everybody get involved. All right, it is 9:01. Welcome everyone to the rulemaking of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. My name is Jeff Robbins. I'm chair of the commission. We have our commissioners with us, and to illustrate that, I will have Ms. Larson have the roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Here.
Commissioner Putnam.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 7 out of 7 commissioners present.
Excellent. Thank you, Hearings Officer Larson. Again, welcome to our stakeholders and to our individuals that are listening in and monitoring the work that we're doing here at the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Just as a recap, yesterday we wrapped up conceptually the second of the series that we were doing rulemaking on. We're doing rulemaking on the 200, 300, 400, 500, and 600 over the course of these last week, this week, and next week. We now have wrapped up conceptually 300 and 500. And this morning we are going to move to a staff presentation around the 400 series, which is sort of the operations series of rules. And I see that we have with us the esteemed panel that is staff of Director Murphy, AAG Joel Miner, AAG Kyle Davenport, as well as some of our managers. And I will not steal your thunder, Director Murphy. I will let you introduce your team that will be presenting to us on the 400 series. So we look forward to hearing from you this morning, and then we will have discussion amongst commissioners about the presentation. And then this afternoon, I believe we'll be moving into party presentations around the 400 series. So with that, the esteemed Director Julie Murphy has the floor. Thank you.
Chair, you're very gracious. And Ms. Larson, can we have the presentation queued up, please? Excellent. To kind of set a bit of a roadmap, I think staff has an hour-ish, maybe an hour and a half of presentation to walk through the 400 series. Again, my name is Julie Murphy. I'm the director of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Next slide, please. Excellent. So I'm here to give you a quick overview, I think, of some of the big picture highlights, flag a couple of changes from the 817 draft that you've looked at, and also then introduce the folks who are going to be talking to you today. As the chair noted, today we dig in really into the substance of the regulatory requirements. So for example, I think about the 300 series as how we receive and review information related to permitting, spacing, etc. The 500 series is how the commission, we, in that sentence, by the way, was staff for the most part, although there are some very important commissioner considerations in the 300 series. And then the 500 series is how you, the commissioners, receive and review information to make decisions. So 400 begins the operational requirements. So for example, in 300, operators are, or the 300 series sets out how you plan for noise, and the 400 series sets out what COGCC's noise requirements are. And so if we can keep that in mind today as we're working through it, I think it'll help frame up the information that you've had over the past 6 days, and also what we're talking about today and for the next few days. A couple of highlights to, I think, flag are, the 400 and 401 is talking about spacing and some of the spacing changes that have been proposed by staff. Rules 405 and 412 really are discussing how operators are keeping folks in the area informed about what's happening on site. The nuisance rules have gotten a lot of attention, 422 to 427. I wanted to note that we'll spend a little bit of time talking about wellbore integrity and what the commission accomplished in June, because again, those rules are critical to protecting groundwater. They are an absolutely integral step into the success of implementing 181's increased protections. Because of the rules adopted, Colorado is a leader in protecting groundwater. And because of that work, there aren't that many downhole requirements put forward to you today because the commission has done a lot of that work. Stepping then to the severance tax audit, this is just kind of a flag. It's we were audited. Some of the changes we proposed to 429 and 430 are in response to that audit to make sure we are compliant. There are some important water protections that we're going to talk about this morning. In Rule 411, it's gotten a lot of stakeholder attention. We're really proud of the protections it encompasses, and that relates to public water systems. Rule 421 are our protections for floodplains. We had a good rule that was clearly written, so we haven't proposed lots of changes to that. Rule 431, again, is an important component of the 300 series, is planning for reuse and recycling of water and produced water, and then 431 is how we're tracking it, how we're gathering that data. Last, and this rule is a new one, and Greg will talk about it, but it's our, it's for the first time, our staff being able to get an as-built construction plan, which is an important component. Next slide, please. So I said I would flag a couple of changes. Scott Cuthbertson, our Deputy Director, will be talking to you today about some changes that we proposed from the 817 draft to better clarify the requirements for documenting meter calibration. And then as we worked through the 400 series, we realized we needed to correct some incorporations by reference. That's a very important legal thing, but slightly mundane to work through, so we may not, just wanted to flag that it's an issue. Next slide. And this is my final slide, I promise. We'll actually turn this over to the folks who know the most about it. So today we'll start with Ms. Jane Stanzik. And again, she is going to spend some time talking to you about the spacing changes in particular. And, you know, when she spoke to you last in the 300 series, she was talking about how spacing is requested from the commission. And today she'll be talking about what those spacing standards and expectations are. Similarly, Mike Leonard will be speaking to you for the first time today, and we are extremely proud to announce that he is our official compliance unit manager. He's been overseeing the field team in an interim capacity, and he survived an extremely competitive process and is now our manager, and we're just thrilled about it. He has 25 years in the field and over a decade with the commission, but he has been the leader working with how to get notices out to communities about what's happening on site, and then also on the nuisance standards. So for example, in the 300 series, we had explicit plans for noise, odor, and dust. And in the 400 series, we're articulating what those standards are, including a consideration of cumulative impacts. Similarly, the 300 series articulates how you engage with communities in advance of the commission making a decision on a permit. And then the 400 series articulates how operators communicate with the community as if a site is approved, how operations are continuing. Again, Dave Andrews, we met him last week also talking about a couple of different pieces. Today, he's going to go into the groundwater protections that we achieved through the Wellbore integrity rulemaking. In addition, talk about, from my perspective at least, the water planning that was in the 300 and how we're collecting that information on the 5A and the 400 series. Next, Scott Cuthbertson, again, will give you an overview of the audit that occurred and why the rules that staff is proposing in 429, 430 accomplish the objectives set out by the audit and also make us an agency that more clearly has better or more clear regulations. And then this morning, we're going to close out with Greg Duramo, who we've heard a lot from in the 300 series because so much of his team works on the front end surface use permitting. And so today, he'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the water supply planning, which again is in Rule 411. I think it's an incredible protection, and it really represents a lot of stakeholder work and engagement. And so I'm thrilled about it mostly. But how that process works between 300 and 411 will be highlighted today again. So with that, I would turn it over to Ms. Stanzik, and thank you very much for your attention and time today. Again, if there's a burning question we need to take in the midst of a presentation, please don't hesitate to ask. But also we have robust time set aside to talk through any questions you have. So thank you, commissioners.
So was that a polite suggestion that we should hold questions unless they're really critical to the end?
It was a polite suggestion. We're here all day for you. At the same time, like if you think you're going to forget it, getting you the information is the imperative key here. So
great. Thank you, Director Murphy. Good morning, Ms. Stanzik. Great to see you in the house. Look forward to hearing from you. We are fortunate to have you with us. So you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Jane Stanzik. I manage the Permit and Technical Services Unit. The substance of current Rule 318(a) and 318(b) has been on the books with only minor changes since the 1960s. These rules protect correlative rights by regulating how close to a lease line a well can be completed and how close to an existing well a new well can be completed. The minimum distance between well completions also prevents the drilling of unnecessary wells. The current rule language is well location. For a vertical well, the well location at the surface and the well completion in the subsurface is the same. However, for directional wells, including horizontal wells, this is not the case. The distances in these rules are subsurface setbacks for well completion. They are not setbacks for the location of the well on the surface. For clarity, the language in proposed Rule 401 is location of well completions. These are the statewide default well completion setbacks. Next slide, please. Thank you. In my presentation on the drilling and spacing units last week, I used this slide to illustrate the concept of the drainage radius, or the distance from a well completion that oil and gas are drained from the reservoir. In order to protect correlative rights, a well completion must be at least that distance from a lease line. In this spacing unit example, the area of the lease was too small to accommodate a well. Only by combining several small leases in a drilling and spacing unit could a well be drilled and completed to produce the oil and gas resources. Next slide, please. However, as illustrated in this slide, on a larger lease, one or more wells can be drilled and completed without violating correlative rights. Next slide, please. Proposed Rule 401 has setback distances for deeper well completions and smaller setback distances for shallower well completions. Reservoir characteristics such as pressure, porosity, and permeability determine the drainage radius for a well completed in a reservoir. In general, the deeper the reservoir, the greater the pressure, and the greater the distance that a well will drain that reservoir. If an operator has sufficient geologic and engineering data to determine the actual drainage reservoir in a deeper, to determine the actual drainage radius in a deeper reservoir and determines that it is less than 600 feet, or in a shallower reservoir determines that it's less than 200 feet, they can apply to the Commission for approval of a spacing order with a smaller setback distance from a lease line or from a unit boundary that is based on the actual drainage radius. The same data is used to determine the appropriate distance between wells and thereby the appropriate number of wells to develop a reservoir. Some stakeholders requested that proposed Rule 401 include language to exclude land subject to specific spacing orders. Staff did not adopt that suggestion because the proposed rules state that these setbacks apply unless authorized by order of the Commission, meaning that these rules only apply to lands that are not subject to a spacing order. It should be noted that every order of the Commission that establishes completion setbacks from lease lines or unit boundaries and between wells provides relief from the default completion setbacks in these rules. Next slide, please. The current Rule 318 A created the Greater Wattenberg Area, or GWA, within the DJ Basin in northeastern Colorado. This special well location rule established windows for the surface locations of wells and an administrative process through which wellbore spacing units are created by the director's approval of a Form 2 and a requirement for water well testing. The proposed mission change rules eliminate the first two provisions because they do not align with the unified permitting process of the Oil and Gas Development Plan, or OGDP. The requirement for water well testing will be maintained in proposed Rule 615. These new rules define a wellbore spacing unit as a special type of drilling and spacing unit that is for a single well and that overlaps one or more existing units. An application for a wellbore spacing unit is part of an OGDP application and may be applied for statewide. Existing locations and wells in the GWA with their respective units created under Rule 318 A will not be affected by these new rules. Approved Form 2As and Form 2s in the GWA will be valid until expiration. If an approved location is not constructed before the Form 2A expires, a refile Form 2A can be submitted in conjunction with an OGDP application. If an approved well is not drilled before the Form 2 expires, a refile Form 2 can be submitted after the approval of an OGDP application. If the Form 2 included a wellbore spacing unit, the OGDP application will include a spacing application. Next slide, please. The COGCC is a forms-driven agency. Everything outside the hearings unit happens with a form. An application for a permit to conduct oil and gas operations is filed on a form, and the director, or now in the case of the Form 2A and the Form 2B, the commission, approves the form to authorize the operations. The report of a completed operation is filed on a form, and staff processes the form to acknowledge the reported operation and to accept the reported data. With only a few minor exceptions, all the information submitted on a form is saved in our database. Most forms have only one or possibly two purposes and can only be submitted for a particular type of oil and gas facility, such as a well or a location. You have heard the Form 4 sundry notice mentioned in several presentations in this hearing. Just as its name suggests, the Form 4 is a miscellaneous form. It has a variety of purposes, and it can be submitted for nearly every type of facility. The rules contain several instances in which an operator is required to submit a form, such as for the approval of subsequent operations, to report the completion of an operation, or to provide notice of an operation. The form is designed to accommodate these instances, and the required information is captured and saved in the database. The Form 4 can also be submitted for purposes not specified in the rules. With this unique feature, the Form 4 gives staff flexibility to request additional information from operators. By processing the Form 4, staff is able to add that information to the database. Staff frequently requires an operator to file a Form 4 to report compliance with site-specific COAs. Next slide, please. Current Rule 309 moves to the new 400 series as Rule 413. This rule requires operators to submit a Form 7, which is a monthly report of operations for every active well. It is sometimes called the production report because it includes production volumes and sales volumes for a producing well, but it is actually required for every well that has been drilled and not yet plugged. For injection wells, the operator reports the volume of injected fluids. For wells that are neither producing nor injecting, the operator reports the status of the well, which would be shut in or temporarily abandoned. As proposed, the new rule has stronger language regarding proposed Rule 807B that requires an operator to file a different form, the Form 14, to report injected volumes of non-produced Class II fluids. Injection wells and non-produced Class II fluids will be discussed in detail in the 800 series rules. Next slide, please. In the new rules, current Rule 308 capital A will be Rule 416. This rule requires the operator of a well to file a Form 5A completed interval report after the initial completion of the well and after any subsequent changes to a completion. Rule 416 proposes slight revisions that provide more detailed descriptions of the changes to a completion that require a new Form 5A. Rule 416 also updates the rule language with the term stimulation, which was defined in the Wellbore integrity rulemaking. Mike Leonard, the manager of the compliance unit, will continue staff's presentation on the 400 series rules.
Thank you, Ms. Stanzik. Good morning, commissioners. My name is Mike Leonard, and I'm the compliance manager here at the Oil and Gas Commission. I'd like to introduce myself and then the inspection team. Prior to coming to the commission in 2006, I had 26 years experience in oil and gas well completion and repair and facility construction and repair. For 14 years here at the commission, I've worked as a field inspector, field inspection supervisor, quality assurance professional, community relations manager, interim field inspection manager, and now the compliance manager. Currently, the inspection team has 35 full-time employees. 32 of those are the commission's eyes in the field. And there are other units that have people in the field as well, but we have the most. This team's charged with verifying compliance with commission rules, permits, and conditions of approval from the time a location begins construction through completion of final reclamation. It also investigates public complaints. In 2019, this team performed over 37,000 well inspections on over 20,000 locations, and they're on pace to do an increase of about 15% more this year. The three that aren't field-based are myself, the complaint specialist, and our quality assurance professional. Our complaint specialist is the public's first point of contact when submitting a complaint. After review of the complaint, the specialist then assigns it to the proper staff member or appropriate other agency when it's not under the commission's jurisdiction. The specialist also tracks the progress of the investigation and responds back to the complainant with the results. Our quality assurance professional is tasked with ongoing training of field inspectors, reviewing reports, reviewing and updating standard operating procedures, and tracking external training that the field group attends. There's some changes planned to enhance this unit to what will become the compliance unit, but that'll be down the road at a later date. Next slide, please. Okay, except for the move in and rig up of workover rigs and remedial cementing, these notices are currently in rule and were moved to the 400 series as they are operational notices. They're electronically submitted and routed to the appropriate staff and local governments automatically through emails. All of these notices are designed to give staff time to plan and coordinate field inspections or request other information. I'm not going to read through each bullet, but I would like to note that the submittal timing of notices was changed in several. Local governments pointed out that if notices come in on weekends or holidays, it may not provide them with adequate notice. Next slide, please. The surface owner notice is also currently in rule. but it only provides notice to the surface owner where the operation is taking place. This obviously has been problematic, not just in urbanized areas, when without notice, operations near someone's property begin. It can be very disconcerting to the public. Local government notice allows them to plan for such things as potential traffic interruptions or to inspect the current condition of roads that could be impacted by the activity. Staff also felt expanding the notice area for the move-in and rig up of a drilling rig is prudent, as we believe that is the radius of most potential nuisance impacts. Next slide, please. Rule 422 spells out that the relevant local government can have land use and nuisance impact rules, and that they may be stricter than the commissions, and the operator must comply with. Next slide, please. So this chart shows the number and type of complaints the commission received in 2019. As you can see, noise and odors are number 1 and number 2. So let's talk a little bit about noise. Next slide. Noise is measured in decibels, and it has frequency weightings. dBA is the higher frequency. So when you think about dBA, think about speech, whistles, birds chirping, and things like that. dBc is the low frequency portion. So think bass drums or the rumble of a train. dBc can travel farther, and it is more difficult to mitigate. It's important to note that the commission has had noise rules for many years, but we believe they needed to be clarified and strengthened a bit. For instance, the increased time on locations with multiple wells extends that impact. The public may tolerate a nuisance for a short time, but we really need to mitigate these issues that will extend over a longer period of time. Next slide. The current noise rule only mentions that planning would aid in noise control. This current draft codifies that operators need to do that planning to avoid this nuisance impact. It requires operators to show how compliance will be achieved through modeling and the use of best management practices. The current rule also mentions background ambient will be taken into consideration. Excuse me. However, it never set when that measurement should be taken. The draft rule says that ambient levels need to be measured prior to the operation beginning. This is important as it establishes a baseline for future surveys when operations begin. For instance, we recently had a site where the background ambient prior to operations beginning was at a higher level than the current rules allow. In 423B, we've added standards for state park and wildlife areas, which is not in the current rule. The current rule allows for levels in rural and residentially zoned areas to be increased to light industrial or industrial noise levels for drilling, completion, and other operations. You can imagine this has been problematic for nearby residents as well. The draft lowers the permissible level for drilling and completion in these areas by up to 20 decibels from the current rule. And finally, it allows the director to adjust the limits either higher or lower based on consultation and review. Next slide, please. So the next 2 slides reflect the current rule versus the draft rule. In this first slide, it shows the addition of the state park and wildlife areas into the residential zone limits. And because ambient noise is higher during the day, an allowance is made to increase the low frequency level by 5 decibels. This is to encourage operators to perform the noisier operations during the day when it's less disruptive to people. Next slide, please. This slide shows the current rule allowance to increase those levels to the light industrial or the industrial when performing certain operations. This draft rule removes that allowance. Slide, please. Okay. 423C is more of the technical portion of the rules, as it lays out how measurements should be taken and what equipment is required. This allows for consistency when either staff or operators are performing surveys. It also codifies that an operator is only responsible to meet the limits set forth at the time of their development and will not change if these activities listed encroach upon them. As Director Murphy mentioned before, we're bringing in a cumulative impact rule, and this rule 423D is designed to prevent new oil and gas activities from increasing the ambient noise in the surrounding area that include other oil and gas operations. For instance, noise from equipment like compressors set on multiple sites can raise levels from what was a relatively quiet area to a more uncomfortable level. 423E, the rule gives the director the ability to take action if there's a persistent event of non-compliance. I believe you heard in testimony last week of a site in Erie that had a noise issue several years ago. That site consistently exceeded the noise levels. It was severely affecting nearby residents. The operator was continually attempting to mitigate, however, all their efforts were unsuccessful. Under the current rule, the operator is only required to do sound surveys and present them to the commission for consideration and possible action. So in that event, the director really had no ability to take action to mitigate the issue. Next slide, please. I'd like to point out that before we go into lighting, that adequate lighting is essential to safe operations on oil and gas sites. Next slide. First of all, let's talk a little bit about light. Light's measured in lumens, and in short, lumens equal brightness. That brightness can be mitigated and does diminish over distance. As you can see in the chart, it diminishes rapidly over a short distance, and increased mitigation methods that are developed in the planning portion will reduce this even more. For example, as you see in the chart, the use of different types of light bulbs lessen this impact. Next slide. Our current Rule 803 is minimal and somewhat subjective, as there's no real definition of glare. And just pointing lights down and in don't always solve the problem. Again, pre-planning is key in preventing nuisance issues. The draft rule spells out the requirements for both pre-production and production operations. Both have elements of worker safety that have to be considered. But to the greatest extent possible, protections must be taken to protect public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. Since lighting design is a very technical issue, the plans need to be reviewed by a qualified professional to ensure that they're adequate. Next slide, please. 424D sets measurable levels of light emitted respective to land use areas. And 424E minimizes the light emitted when not needed for on-site worker safety or security. In other words, if nobody's on site, lighting should be greatly diminished. And finally, 424F is intended to lower overall light pollution from multiple oil and gas facilities in the area. Next slide. Current Rule 804 requires that equipment must be painted to a color matching, but slightly darker than the surrounding landscape, if it can be seen from a public road. Staff understands more open space trails are being developed for public use, and this equipment should meet the same requirement as it does from public roads. This rule also allows for a variance when a federal agency has a different regulation on federal land. Next slide. As pointed out in the chart earlier, odor is the #2 publicly generated complaint that comes to the commission. With that, staff believes that pre-planning will lessen this nuisance impact. 426A, B, and C require operators to develop plans to minimize odors prior to beginning operations. This plan will describe how the operator will minimize the odors that may leave the boundaries of their operations. It also offers some best management practices that have been found to reduce odors. Excuse me. This list is not intended to be a must-use, but more of a beginner's list for those who may not be familiar with odor reduction. Regarding the odor rules, the commission balanced both the protection of public welfare and the protection of public safety. Drilling fluids can contribute to odor impacts, but the choice of drilling fluids can also impact an operator's ability to maintain well control. For instance, the use of petroleum-based fluid may enable the operator to maintain wellbore integrity, well control, and shorten the time to drill. In contrast, using a water-based fluid can damage the wellbore, lessen the ability to control the well, and greatly increase the time to drill. Going back to that same Erie location that we talked about with noise, they were using water-based fluids there, and that caused the time to drill that well to increase by almost 2 weeks. This increased the time of noise impact by 2 weeks and the number of flaring events. Next slide. As I believe you heard last week, odors can be very transient, and staff cannot always be there when the odors occur. And the current rule does not address potential requirements for air monitoring. When an odor complaint is submitted to staff, the draft rule requires the operator to provide a description of the operations that they were performing at the time of the alleged complaint. This allows staff to determine if the activities could have been the source of the odor and then require additional best management practices or air monitoring. Recently, we had a site that was subject to numerous odor complaints. Staff did detect odors on site, but did not detect odors off site at the time of inspections. The director worked with that operator to voluntarily change drilling fluids to a lower odor fluid, and that greatly diminished the level of complaints after that point. 426E is much like the draft rules in noise and lighting, as it requires operators to address the cumulative odors in places with concentrations of oil and gas activities. This rule differs a bit, as the director may require best management practices through conditions of approval or guidance when there may be exposure to nearby building units or designated outdoor activity areas. 805B is mentioned here as it's one of the current nuisance rules. It does refer to air quality regulations, and staff has decided to move this rule to the 903, Rule 903, and you'll hear about that at a later date. Next slide. Fugitive dust can be very detrimental to nearby residents, wildlife, and plant communities. In 427A, staff believes that pre-planning will prevent many dust-related issues. The information provided in the plans will allow staff to determine if best management practices listed will be adequate to prevent the dust. And 427B requires an operator to cease dust-producing operations until suppression methods are in place. In other words, they may still continue to drill the well, but not allow vehicle traffic on or off the site until suppression methods are implemented. 427C and D spell out what can and cannot be used as suppressants and allows the director to implement additional measures, such as only fresh water in sensitive areas. Next slide. 427E, much like the cumulative odor rule, allows the director to require further mitigation when there are other major sources of dust in the area. Next slide, please. I believe Ms. Stanzik talked to you earlier a little bit about seismic operations. I'm going to talk a little bit about notice and consultation here. Seismic operations can and do occur in residential areas. These operations are labor intensive at the beginning and the end of the operation, which requires several workers accessing various plots of land to place sensors. The middle portion of the operation involves heavy equipment, such as pictured in the slide, that can be in close proximity to the residents. Next slide. Current rule only requires a good faith effort to notify surface owners in the operational area. And this is typically done by flyers and door hangers. This notice did not always get out to all of the surface owners, which resulted in public complaints and concerns. This rule directs that complete notice must be given. Rules 436B and C are not in current rule. Therefore, there was no requirement to notice utility owners who may have concerns about damage to their surface and subsurface utilities from these operations. In the past, after submission of complaints, in 436C, I'm sorry, we've had commission has received complaints about from people saying they were properly noticed. Operators had problems providing proof that they properly noticed everyone in the area. 436D is crafted in response to complaints from the public about potential damage to structure and property from these operations. This rule sets standard for vibration limits when working in proximity to both above and below ground structures. It also requires lower limits when a utility or local government have lower standards. Next slide. Next slide, please. I believe Ms. Stanzik explained shot holes to you in an earlier presentation, but in places where shot holes are used to generate necessary vibrations to perform a survey, this draft adds the requirement that operators must meet local and state rule, not just alcohol, tobacco, and firearms requirements to safely store and use these materials. 436F, in the past, operators have performed only portions of a project. For instance, they may survey 17 square miles of a planned 25 square mile project. This rule requires the reporting of any work done, whether the entire project has been completed or not. And finally, 436G. The current rule 333D requires that the holes that were drilled for the performance of the survey be properly plugged, and there's no outstanding complaints to release the surety for that project. This new rule sets forth the requirements that need to be met prior to the release of that particular project surety. This includes a written request for the project to be released, have no outstanding complaints, clean up all flags, stakes, trash, and etc., and potentially perform compaction alleviation and revegetation operations. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Andrews.
Mr. Leonard, before we turn it over to Mr. Andrews, if I could interject. Director Murphy, I know you politely cautioned us to wait until the very bitter end to ask questions, but I have to be honest, this is a lot of information, and it might be better, or we may be more successful if we ask in questions of each of the witnesses before we move to the next section, since all the things are sort of not, I mean, they're all under 400, but they're all different. And so I would look to you and or look to commissioners in terms of nimbleness and process. What do folks think is the best way? Do you want to hear everything and then go back and ask questions? Do you want to ask questions of a witness while it's fresh? There's no right or wrong answer. Director Murphy, do you have any thoughts about that?
I would offer one thing. We can do both. I think probably it would be helpful for us if a witness can get through their presentation, but then like if we want to talk to Mike about noise or seismic or whatever else right now, that's great for any questions that are right now. And then if other questions come up throughout the course of the morning, the day, the next 2 days, we're here too. So I think that's a good observation, Chair. I kind of forget, since I've been through these presentations a time or two, that it makes more sense, especially I think in the 400 series where we have slightly more discrete topics to talk to witnesses or talk to staff members as they complete their presentation.
Commissioners, do folks have a thought on this? I don't want to drag out the issue.
No preference on my end, Mr. Chair.
I'm looking to see all of you. Okay. Well, if we don't have any real preference, I'm taking notes. I'll ask my questions at the end. Let's just keep moving through it. Mr. Andrews, you're up.
Thank you, Chair Robbins. Just an audio check. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
All right, and let me get my presentation going here. Sorry, give me a moment, just rearranging some windows. All right, good morning, commissioners, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm Dave Andrews, the Commission's Engineering Manager. As discussed during my 300 series presentation, the Commission adopted sweeping, nation-leading changes to our wellbore integrity rules. The new rules add an enhanced review of hydraulic fracturing proposed for depths shallower than 2,000 feet. They also expand on current policies for offset well evaluations that will be required by rule for all new wells. We strengthened cementing requirements for new casing and remedial cement. The new rules update blowout prevention equipment standards. They prescribe statewide braden head monitoring and testing, and they add notice requirements for plugging wells. We had broad stakeholder support for the wellbore integrity rules. The proposed 400 series rules include many important changes and additions for oil and gas locations and wells. Slides that follow will illustrate basic casing geometry, the general order of drilling and completion operations, and methods for reaching out into a reservoir from multi-well pads. Steel casing, cement, and geologic formations provide barriers for wellbore integrity to isolate groundwater from hydrocarbons. This figure shows concentric casing with different diameters used in combination with cement in the well for isolation. Conductor pipe is used in areas where shallow soils or rock have the potential to cave in into the wellbore while drilling the surface hole. Surface casing is set and fully cemented to isolate groundwater and to serve as a component of the blowout prevention equipment while drilling below surface casing. The vertical scale is compressed on this figure. As shown in the notes to the right of the casing on the diagram, conductor pipe is generally less than about 100 feet deep. Surface casing is typically hundreds of feet deep in most areas of the state, although there are certain areas such as the Wattenberg field where casing is commonly 1,500 feet or deeper, and portions of the Piceance Basin at high elevations where surface casing may reach depths of about 2,500 feet. Intermediate casing is not used in most Colorado wells. However, when it is used, it's generally several thousand feet deep below the surface casing, but not as deep as production casing. The innermost casing or production casing is used in most Colorado wells and is typically thousands of feet deep. So here we'll run through an animation of a typical drilling and completion operation. We have shown here a rig at the surface, groundwater near surface, and then the oil and gas objective producing zone at the bottom of the figure. First, the operator would drill the surface hole, and then surface casing is set in that hole and fully cemented. Again, the main purpose of the surface casing is to isolate groundwater, but it also serves as a support for the rest of the well, including the blowout prevention equipment. After surface casing is set and cemented, a formation integrity test will be run. This is a new rule requirement. The test ensures that when the well is drilled to total depth, the drilling fluid weight used at that depth will not break down the formation below the surface casing. The formation integrity test would also identify whether or not there are any pathways that may be leading out to the formation below the surface casing. Next, the production hole is drilled. And open hole logging tools are run. Here in the diagram, you can see several different lines on, these are called tracks. So over on the left, you would see a gamma ray and a spontaneous potential. And then over on the right-hand side, just past the depths shown on this chart, would be electrical resistivity and conductivity tracks. So the main reason for running these logs is to help determine where geologic formations are located and also the content of the pores in the pore space, whether it's gas or oil or water. Next, production casing is run in the hull and cemented up to the specified point shown on the permit. Next, cased hole logs are run for identification of gas in particular. Normally a neutron density log is run, which is shown on the left-hand side here. Where those curves cross over, the two different tools have different ways of measuring hydrogen content. So when the crossover occurs, you'll see darker shaded intervals on the bottom left slide. Over on the right, another cased hole log that is recorded in all wells is a cement bond log. So the purpose of the cement bond log is to measure acoustic waves, which gives you an indication of cement presence and quality behind the casing. So in this figure up at the top on the right, that's a depiction of a tool, a cement bond log tool that is run in the well. And as Ms. Stanzik described yesterday for seismic, or maybe that was last week, but for seismic reflection, it's pretty much the same type of principle where you have a wave and then you end up stacking those waves on top of each other. And in the end, you get a depiction of the cement in the well on the bottom two figures. So the first one shows free pipe where cement is not present, and then down below that, fully cemented casing. So just some tools that operators use and our engineers use when evaluating wellbore construction. So after casing is cemented, all logs are run, frac head would be installed after the rig moves off. Completion fluid would be placed in the casing. A perforating gun would be lowered into the casing to the oil and gas producing zone. And then the casing would be perforated. The perforations extend through the casing and through the cement sheath into the formation. Next, hydraulic fracturing and treatment would commence. And then a completion rig would move on, set the tubing and prep the well for sales. And you've heard me mention the word Braden head a few times. In this case, where we have surface casing and a production casing, the annular space in between those two casings and the surface interval is the Braden head annulus, and then that would extend down into the well between the production casing and the wellbore wall down below the surface casing. In the next few slides, I'll review common designations for different wellbore orientations. So here we have a well pad that has vertical, one drifted, and several directional S-shaped wells. We have another well off to the right, which is a different type of directional well called a slant directional. And then we have a few horizontal wells that enter the ground for the most part vertically at the well pad surface, extend down towards the producing formation, and then they would travel horizontally or laterally from that point. So here's the model I started with. We have a horizontal surface. I have a little map shown there over on the left, and then a vertical plane. So when we're looking at this on our system map in COGIS, what we would see is a pad with several wells coming off of it. This is kind of what I used as my guide when I was drawing the three-dimensional image. So these are 40-acre quarter sections, and as you can see in this case, several bottom hole locations extend off of that particular well pad. So those would be the S-shaped directional wells. And then also we have some wells that are going from the top of the figure down to the bottom of the figure. Those are horizontal wells that were drilled from a pad off of the top of the figure. So looking at the different examples on the map view, a vertical well would just show up as a single point. A drifted well would start at the well pad, and then the bottom of the hole would be somewhat close to the well pad, but separated on the map view. For a directional S-shaped well or a slant, it will appear as a line with the well starting at the well pad, and then the bottom hole would be off in a different direction. And then finally, horizontal wells will appear also as a line on our map. So when operators and our engineers are reviewing well bores, we really need to think in 3 dimensions. So starting from the map view and then going to a cross section or side view, you'll see an example of an S-shaped directional well here, highlighted in green. For horizontal wells, again, they usually drill the well mostly vertical until they reach or get close to the objective formation, and then the remainder of the well would head off in a horizontal direction. So putting it all together, this looks at the well pad that I mentioned before that had a vertical well, a drifted well, and several S-shaped directional wells. In the upper left figure, you can see it drilling down to the intended completion formation with the hydrocarbons. Over on the lower right, it's the same figure, but that formation is stripped away just so you can see how the wells end at their total depth. And then in the lower left, that's an example of a slant directional well. So taking a little bit closer look at the horizontal wells, again, they're drilled down to the objective formation and then horizontally thereafter. But really when we talk about offset well evaluation, this is what our engineers are envisioning in their minds. So we've got the S-shaped directional pad, and let's say an operator comes in and proposes to drill horizontal wells. In the end, we have to make sure that those horizontal wells are avoiding the directional wells and any vertical wells that may be in their path. So this takes it back to the plan or map view. So again, we would have, in this case, a few different well pads. One would have primarily directional, S-shaped directional and vertical wells. Down to the below that, we've got an older well pad that had a single, somewhat vertical well. You see it as a line here, so maybe that was more drifted. And then over on the left would be the well pad for the horizontal wells. So tying that into Rule 416, we'll take a look at the completed portion of the well at the bottom of the production casing. In this case, there are 2 objective hydrocarbon formations shown in olive green. 4 wells are shown with cemented production casing. Perforations are shown as horizontal lines through the cement. Again, the perfs go through both the casing and the cement into the formation. This allows gas to flow into the well, or in the example on the right, to allow stimulation fluid to flow out through the perforations during treatment. The new perforations are shown with a blue symbol on the left 2 wells. When reperforating, the same intervals are perforated again. In the second well from the left, new zones may be completed when permitted to do so. So this shows a new completion in the upper objective formation. The red colored interval at the bottom of the commingled well, second from the left, represents an interval that is squeezed with cement at the bottom of the well. So what we're really trying to illustrate here is on the well, second from the left, is the total gross completion or gross completed interval has changed after the second set of perfs were put in, and also when the well was plugged back from the bottom. The blue rectangle with an X in the temporarily abandoned well represents a mechanical plug. And then similar symbols on the well furthest to the right represent a packer at the bottom of the stimulation string. Proposed Rule 416 expands on different types of well operations requiring a Form 5A, or a completed interval report. Form 5As are important to document completed intervals in a well. Most wells that are hydraulically fractured or otherwise stimulated end up producing from these oil and gas zones. With regard to permit status, location status, and well status, I would like to clarify the meaning of the word abandoned. Despite what you may think about other common uses of the word, in the commission rules, it means to properly restore the oil and gas location after production activities have ceased. In the case of a location, the location may have been permitted, but it was not built. Similarly, for a well, the well may have been permitted, but it was not drilled. So those would be referred to as abandoned locations or abandoned permits, well permits. For wells that the operator drilled, there are a few terms that include the word abandoned. So a dry and abandoned well was drilled, but the operator determined that to be uneconomic at the time, and it was plugged shortly thereafter. A temporarily abandoned well, as shown on the last slide, may have a downhole plug to isolate the completed interval, or it may be missing surface equipment necessary to produce the well. Sorry. Plugging and abandonment is really a much bigger process than you might think. So when we say a well is plugged and abandoned, that's really the first two bullets here, where downhole plugs have been set and the well has been cut off with a welded plate and a marker and cement at the surface. But there's really more to plugging and abandonment. Part of that is removing production equipment, abandoning flow lines or removing those flow lines, and then remediating and reclaiming the location. So an orphaned well or a site is not abandoned in the Commission's use of the word abandoned because the operator or soon-to-be former operator, if it's a bond claim, did not finish its obligation of plugging and abandonment as defined in the rule. The Commission is responsible for completing any remaining plugging and abandonment activities after a well or site becomes orphaned through our orphaned well program. The program is funded from bond claims and a budget appropriation from active operators who pay into levy payments and also from penalty revenue. So I grew up in Michigan with the Great Lakes and rivers, creeks, swamps, and everything wet all around me. I certainly appreciated water at the time, but it was more about keeping water away from things rather than collecting it. It seemed that everyone had a drainage ditch in their backyard and a sump pump in their basement. I moved to Colorado about the time of the Hayman fire in 2002. My sinuses soon dried up, and I invested in lots of chapstick until my body acclimated to the dry weather. It did not take long to learn how important water is in the West and to understand that a drainage ditch is much different than an irrigation ditch. 18 years later, I appreciate water and consequences of drought in the West, even more as the Pine Gulch fire fills our skies on the western slope. I would like to take a moment to say thank you to the firefighters that are doing everything they can to keep us all safe from the ongoing wildfires. Proposed Rule 431 is related to oil and gas industry water use. So on this figure, you can see over on the right, produced water tanks. Those would be at the wellheads. And then that water would move either via pipeline or truck to an injection well directly, or it could go to treatment for recycling, for other uses in the oil and gas industry, or reuse. And it ends up taking different paths, basically, depending on how good the water quality is from an oil and gas perspective for reuse on drilling or hydraulic fracturing. Proposed Rule 431 expands on current Rule 330, adding requirements to report water used for drilling by type. Water reporting, shown here for hydraulic fracturing, is already required in Form 5A, completed interval report, and has been required since 2011. The new requirement would add similar rules for Form 5 for the drilling completion report. Current Rule 330 would become Rule 431 again. As discussed on the last slide, key changes are related to reporting water used for drilling operations. Now I would like to transition to our Deputy Director, Scott Cuthbertson. Scott will review changes to meter calibration rules, including proposed Rule 431C, picking up where this slide ends.
Before you jump in, I do want to note that commissioners, if you want to jump in with questions now about Dave's or Jane's or Mike's presentations, happy to take them.
I think at this point, we're just going to power through and do questions at the end. Maybe we'll get through everything, take a break, and then come back to questions. And we can go sequentially and start with Jane, and then go to Mike, and then go to Dave, and then go to Scott, et cetera.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews and Mr. Chair. Good morning, commissioners and stakeholders. My name is Scott Cuthbertson, and I am the Deputy Director of Operations for this commission. I have the honor of supporting the great team of managers that you've heard from already and are presenting with me today. I'm a licensed professional engineer and began my career as a process design engineer with Conoco, finishing my career with Conoco as the Director of Environmental Affairs of what is now the Suncor refinery in Commerce City. I joined the commission in November of last year after a 20-year career with the State Engineer's Office, the last 10 of which I served as a Deputy State Engineer. I'm going to present on just one topic, meter calibration. The current measurement of oil and measurement of gas rules in Rules 328 and 329 move to Rules 429 and 430 in the proposed changes. The only change in the proposed rules concerns the issue of meter calibration and is a result of a 2019 severance tax audit by the Office of the State Auditor that was released to the public in January of 2020. The Oil and Gas Conservation Commission was a part of the audit primarily because it is funded in part by severance tax. The auditor also believes our Form 7 monthly production reports provide important information. The auditor made 3 recommendations to the commission. 2 of those recommendations involving production reports and coordination with the Department of Revenue had no impact on our rules. The 3rd recommendation was based on a finding that even though our rules require operators to calibrate their inline meters annually, the audit team could not find consistent evidence that our inspection process was checking the calibration date of the meter. Next slide, please. As a result, we proposed an amendment to Rules 429 and 430 that require operators to post a copy of the meter calibration at the meter. I want to draw your attention, as Director Murphy did previously, to the fact that this presentation is recommending a further refinement to the draft rule proposed on August 17th. As we continued to have conversations with stakeholders and further reviewed the recommendation of the state auditor, we realized our August 17th draft was unnecessarily complicated. All we really need to see is the date of the most recent calibration. This will enable the inspector to confirm compliance and document the compliance by implementing a very simple change to the field inspection form. As a result, we are recommending the language in Rules 429J2 and 430D2 be modified to that shown in the presentation. Next slide, please. Just for the purposes of demonstration, this is an example of the type of information many, if not most, operators already maintain at the meter. The consensus response from our operator stakeholders is that this rule change can be easily implemented. Next slide, please. Even though not addressed by the audit, in the course of our conversations on rules 429 and 430, operators suggested the meter calibration language in rule 431C be modified for consistency. As a result, we are also suggesting the modification shown here be made as well. Thank you for your attention, and I'll hand the presentation off to Environmental Manager Greg Dronlo.
Thank you, Mr. Cuthbertson. Good morning, Commissioners. Thanks for the opportunity to provide this overview on staff's proposed rules. I'm Greg Duranlo, and I will be talking with you today about COGCC's rules designed to protect public water systems. I'll also touch briefly on proposed rules 406 and 407 pertaining to location, construction, and reporting. Before we get started, I really need to acknowledge certain people who have played a significant role in getting us to where we are today. John Duggan and Sean Hackett at CDPHE, Kevin Donegan at the Division of Water Resources, and stakeholders, including both active and interested public water system providers, industry, and local governments. To name a few specifically, Matt Sura, representing public water system providers and local governments, has been a tireless advocate for these protections, and Kelsey Wazelinski, representing Great Western Operating Company, has been fully engaged in this process, and they continue to work to refine what we've proposed. Public water system, or PWS protection, is an important function for the COGCC, and since 2009, it has been implemented through Rule 317B. The Commission adopted Rule 317B in 2008 as part of the HB 07-1341 rulemaking, with a very specific purpose of protecting surface water intakes from the immediate risks associated with spills at upstream oil and gas facilities. I will be providing a little historical context of Rule 317B prior to digging into staff's proposed Rule 411. I intend to show you the importance of Rule 317B, why it was effective, and why staff is building on its success. What's shown here is a stretch of the Colorado River, not the Sasquatch River, in western Colorado. Next, please. There you go. There are two public water system surface water intakes associated with a municipality and a neighboring planned unit development community. Zooming in on a short stretch upstream from the intakes, next slide please, we see that prior to 2008, numerous oil and gas locations were constructed in very close proximity to the river. And zooming in further, you can see that these oil and gas locations were constructed very close to the main stem of the Colorado River, within 200 and 600 feet. The tank batteries, although on the far side of the river, were situated within 50 feet of a slough that is hydrologically connected to the river. And there have been documented spills at two of the tank batteries. Next slide, please. Zooming back out to the longer stretch of the river, you can see the numerous oil and gas locations and their proximity to the surface water source for the public water systems. Obviously, upstream oil and gas development and spills at those facilities put those water supplies at risk. Next, please. So in 2008, the Commission wisely adopted Rule 317 Big B, establishing 3 buffer zones around the classified water segments for 5 miles upstream from surface water intakes. The internal buffer zone was a no surface occupancy area from the ordinary high water mark out to 300 feet on each side of the protected water. This meant that without a variance in which the CDPHE consulted and the operator demonstrated that the location could be operated with protections equivalent to not constructing the location at all, then the location would be prohibited. The intermediate buffer zone was from 300 to 500 feet from the edge of the water, and it's shown by the very narrow strip in the middle of those zones. This allowed operations with fewer restrictions than in the internal and intermediate, in the intermediate zone, certain operating restrictions and required specific best management practices were required for the protection of the water source. The external buffer zone was established from 500 feet to a half mile from the waterway, and that allowed operations with fewer restrictions than in the internal and intermediate buffer zones, but still more protections than outside the surface water supply area. Next, please. As you can see in this image, relatively few locations have been permitted since 2009 within or partly within these surface water supply areas. We view that as a success of the 317B rule. Of the 10 Form 2As within the surface water supply area shown, 5 were to amend existing locations, 3 were on the other side of I-70 from the river, and 9 out of 10 were within the external buffer zone, with only 1 encroaching on the intermediate buffer zone. Additionally, 12 spills have been reported in this particular surface water supply area, and some never left the secondary containment, but 1 traveled 550 feet from the point of origin. The protections afforded by Rule 317B underscore that timely response to spills is of utmost importance. As was stated in the Statement of Basis and Purpose from 2008, a significant release in these areas would likely contaminate surface water used as a drinking water source quickly, thereby not allowing the public water system, the oil and gas operator, nor the COGCC enough time to respond effectively to protect the public water system. Staff's proposed Rule 411 keeps these important protections intact. Next, please. In 2008, the Commission deferred the inclusion of an important subset of public water system intakes, those wells known as groundwater under the direct influence of surface water, or GUDI wells. Despite a commitment in the Statement of Basis and Purpose for 2008, these wells have not been addressed, and it's overdue. This is another reason I feel strongly that the changes staff is proposing to extend the protections of public water systems to GUDI wells and also to Type 3 aquifer wells, which I will describe later, are so integral to successfully implementing Senate Bill 19-181's prioritization of public health. Next slide, please. To define groundwater under the direct influence of surface water, staff proposes to use a definition consistent with CDPHE Water Quality Control Commission and U.S. Environmental Protection Agency definitions. This definition simply means that the groundwater is so closely tied to the surface water system that any impacts to the surface water relatively immediately affect the groundwater. In the next couple slides, I will describe various water sources and then discuss how we've proposed to address them under Rule 411. Next, please. And I'll just start off by saying that I wish my diagrams were as technically brilliant as Mr. Andrews. This diagram shows a very simple hydrologic system. This could be the Sasquatch River. This system consists of a river, an unconfined aquifer, a confining layer, and a confined aquifer. The water table in the unconfined aquifer is symbolized by the inverted triangle. The aquifers in this diagram are entirely encompassed by the protections of the surface casing program discussed earlier by Mr. Andrews. The Division of Water Resources classifies the confined aquifers as Type 1, defined as being overlain by relatively impermeable geologic material. Unconfined aquifers are classified as Type 2 and are defined as consolidated geologic material or crystalline rock that is not overlain by a confining layer. In this example, a spill near the river has the potential to immediately impact a surface water, public water system intake. Next, please. Water wells completed in the Type 1 confined aquifers, such as the Laramie Fox Hills Aquifer in the Denver Basin, are very common. These wells are not susceptible to contamination at the surface due to the typical depth of the aquifer, the overlying rock formations and confining layers, and the water well construction itself. Type 2 wells are completed above a confining layer and may be completed in fractured bedrock, such as in the mountains and foothills west of Denver, or they may be completed in sedimentary layers of various porosity and permeability near the surface. Because they are transport limited, contaminants from the surface may take years to reach the groundwater table and potentially impact a type 2 well. Next, please. Like many river channels and associated lowlands, this river is underlain by alluvial or colluvial sediments, which are unconsolidated material consisting of sands and gravels of variable sorting formed by erosion and deposition over time. Water can move readily through these materials, and therefore the water table can fluctuate rapidly and contaminants can be transported quickly. This aquifer is a type 3 aquifer. Next, please. A well completed in this type 3 aquifer may be a groundwater under the direct influence of surface water well. When this well is pumped, the drawdown begins pulling from the river. You can see here that any impacts to the surface water would rapidly affect water entering the well. This transport mechanism is on the order of hours or days at the longest. Next slide, please. Yeah, you got it. Not all wells completed in this type 3 aquifer are directly connected to the surface water system, although all Goody wells are type 3 wells. Type 3 wells that are not groundwater under direct influence of surface water wells are less susceptible to surface impacts than Goody wells, but more susceptible than type 2 wells. A spill at the surface near a type 3 well that is not groundwater under direct influence has the potential to affect the well weeks, months, or years after the spill, depending on the properties of the soil, the volume of the spill, and even the pump rate of the well. With all that as background, let's now turn to staff's proposed rules. In making the change from 317B to 411, staff is proposing major changes. Structurally, we have completely overhauled the rule to make it more clear and understandable. The structure of Rule 317B was both hard to implement and hard to administer, although the protections were good. We've divided proposed Rule 411 into 3 sections, one for each of the types of public water system intakes for which we've developed protections: the surface water supply areas, the groundwater under direct influence of surface water, and type 3 aquifer public water system supply wells. Next slide, please. First, we'll talk about the changes to the protections for surface water supply areas. This outline lays out the basic structure for each subsection of Rule 411, so you will see this repeated in the slides to come. We have maintained the intent of Rule 317B to protect vulnerable surface water intakes from upstream spills, but we removed unnecessary rule-specific definitions. For example, drilling, completion, production, and storage operations, or DCPS operations, was only used in former Rule 317B. The activities included are covered by our universal definition of oil and gas operations, so it was not necessary to maintain that term. We've appropriately defined surface water supply area, and we've left alone the definition of classified water segment, which includes perennial and intermittent, but not ephemeral streams. Staff has proposed changing the buffer zone widths within the surface water supply area. In our proposal, we've widened the internal NSO buffers, no surface occupancy buffer, to 1,000 feet. This change is made consistent with the mandate to prioritize protection of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. As mentioned earlier in my discussion about 317B areas, we've seen spills travel greater distances than the 300-foot internal buffer zone. Additionally, between 2014 and 2019, operators reported 40 spills which reached surface water, which amounts to about 1% of all spills, although this statistic does include spills that affected dry drainages called surface waters. Further, this change is consistent with various Bureau of Land Management resource management plans, which create a 1,000-foot buffer from classified water segments. We've also maintained the rigorous standard of protection that is substantially equivalent to not being there at all for variance approval. Consistent with that buffer zone expansion, staff proposed an intermediate buffer zone of 1,000 to 1,500 feet and retained the half mile as the outer boundary of the external buffer zone. Staff maintained all existing protections for each zone, but added the following in the intermediate zone: line tank batteries, a pit prohibition, daily inspection requirements, spill response equipment being placed on site, and a chemical prohibition for hydraulic fracturing additives, which I will discuss later. Surface water sampling requirements are unchanged from Rule 317 Big B. Staff has also proposed a formal consultation process with public water system operators for locations proposed within the surface water supply area. Spill and release notification requirements apply to all locations 15 miles upstream of a PWS surface water intake, and operators must notify the public water system of any reportable spills in addition to the reporting requirements spelled out in the 900 series rules. For groundwater under, next slide please. For groundwater under the direct influence of surface water wells, we have proposed radial buffers of protection. These protections are specific to the risks posed to this type of wells, this type of water source, and are again reflective of the immediacy of the potential impacts to occur. Like surface water supply areas, we propose a no surface occupancy out to 1,000 feet from the well with the same stringent standards for variance approval. The intermediate zone from 1,000 to 1,500 feet affords the same protections as the surface water supply area intermediate zone, including the chemical prohibition. The external buffer zone around a groundwater under the direct influence of surface water well extends to ½ mile and includes a drilling pit prohibition. As for surface water supply area protections, any requirement imposed in the external zone apply to the intermediate zone as well. And likewise, if the Commission approves a variance to the no surface occupancy internal zone, then the operating practices required in the external and intermediate zone would be required at a minimum. For consultation for proposed locations within a ½ mile of a public water system Goody well, one item specifically discussed would be groundwater monitoring. And if groundwater monitoring is determined to be appropriate, then the terms of the monitoring and reporting would also be specified as a condition of approval. Spill and emergency response requirements are very similar to that of a surface water supply area. Next slide, please. Where a public water system is served by a type 3 aquifer well that is not groundwater under the direct influence of surface water, the requirements are somewhat different than for that of a Goody well. Because the immediacy of risk is significantly lower, this rule has been tailored to provide appropriate protections to this type of water supply. The protections afforded here are appropriate to address the relatively longer contaminant migration pathway to reach a type 3 well that is not a Goody well should spills occur nearby. Significantly, we have proposed a 1,000-foot no surface occupancy around the wells and a prohibition of the same chemicals out to 1,500 feet. The staff draft also includes consultation with the public water system supplier for locations proposed within a ½ mile. And again, that consultation would include a discussion about groundwater monitoring. Stakeholders were passionate about the inclusion of type 3 aquifer public water system wells for additional protection. And staff is excited to have been able to collaboratively develop this protection regime. Next slide, please. Consistent with the importance of protecting public water systems and their surface and groundwater sources, staff has adopted a recommendation to prohibit certain chemicals as additives to hydraulic fracturing fluids within 1,500 feet of any public water system source. The chemicals listed in Table 411-1 were included because of their relatively acute human toxicity, their miscibility, or both. It is appropriate to restrict the use of these chemicals where, if spilled, they could have an immediate impact on a public water system. Staff has also proposed that if reused or recycled produced water is used as a base fluid in these vulnerable areas, the concentrations of chemicals in the base fluid be minute. Staff recognizes that this will disincentivize the recycling and reuse of produced water for locations in these areas, but we anticipate that will affect relatively few oil and gas locations, and the trade-off for public water system protections are worth it. Next, please. The bottom line is that we need to make sure that this is protective of this. Next slide. Stakeholders, CDPHE, stakeholders, COGCC, and CDPHE have reached out to the Division of Water Resources, who have provided invaluable help in getting a data set of groundwater under direct influence of surface water and type 3 wells, which could be mapped on COGCC's online map tools. What you see here is the collective data set of, can we go back one slide, please? Thank you. What you see here is the collective data set of Goody and type 3 aquifer public water supply wells throughout the state. Now, next slide. Zooming into the San Juan Basin, you can see that the surface water supply areas are represented by the dendritic linear features, or blue squiggles. These map layers have not yet been updated from the 317B buffer zones, but that data set will be forthcoming when the buffer zone distances are set. Next slide, please. Because the public water system intake locations are protected under the Homeland Security Act, agencies are not allowed to make their locations publicly available. COGCC's GIS team has taken the spatial data for each groundwater under the direct influence of surface water well listed by CDPHE and each type 3 well based on Division of Water Resources evaluation and provided an obscured generalized location for each PWS intake that can be used for operators for planning purposes. Each PWS well location subject to Rule 411, for each PWS well location subject to Rule 411, COGCC has buffered that quarter section by 1/2 mile and highlighted each quarter section that the 1/2 mile buffer encounters. And so for each of those blobs, the grid in them represents a quarter section. And so 4 of those is a mile. The resulting blob is indicative of a PWS well somewhere near the middle, but the exact location cannot be determined without consultation with the PWS operator or CDPHE. The green blobs represent type 3 aquifer public water system wells, and the blue blobs represent the groundwater under direct influence wells. This approach provides operators with the necessary information to effectively plan to avoid and prevent impacts to public drinking water supplies. With that, I will now move quickly to Rules 406 and 407 regarding location construction. Next slide, please. Rule 406 provides general requirements for location construction. Some of these rules are new, some previously existed. Staff felt that it made sense to bring them all together in one place. Quite simply, Rule 406A requires operators to construct their locations in conformance with their Form 2A. There are numerous examples where operators have constructed significantly larger locations than permitted, built locations in entirely different places than permitted, constructed different equipment than listed, or failed to construct BMPs or best management practices as described in the permit. This rule makes it clear that the design submitted and approved for the permit should be the final design and actually what the operator builds. The COGCC has long required the posting of the approved permit to drill on the rig. However, there has not been a similar requirement for the Form 2A. So Rule 406C requires the posting of the Form 2A so that it is clear what site design and construction details were approved and what conditions of approval and best management practices must be followed. Rule 406E codifies the existing COGCC notice to operators regarding conductor setting. Staff has attempted to simplify the language to make it straightforward for rule understanding and implementation, but we recognize that guidance will also be necessary. Operators may build a location under a valid Form 2A and preset some or all of the conductor casing as part of location construction. This rule requires that the operator take measures to protect public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources when leaving conductors undrilled for any length of time. This rule also clarifies when and how undrilled conductors need to be prepared for site reclamation. Built locations with preset conductors result in unnecessary surface disturbance, site degradation, and pose a potential hazard to public and wildlife. This rule ensures that conductors will be appropriately used. Rule 407 requires a location construction report. This is a new requirement for oil and gas locations. We've essentially required the same information for wells with the Form 5 and 5A that have been discussed previously. And this Rule 407 documents whether the site was built in accordance with the permits and if any modifications were necessary, that they are documented in the location file. For the first time also, the COGCC will now actually have shapefiles for its online map tool instead of just approximated dots. This will aid the public, local governments, and the COGCC's compliance team in knowing where oil and gas operations are taking place. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. Director Murphy, would you like to add anything?
Thank you, Greg, for the thorough and detailed presentation, and thanks to the rest of the team for putting forward staff's recommended revisions to the 400 series. Again, as we think about where we are in the process, the 400 series guides operations in terms of at the permitting stage, what our expectations are. So for example, a no surface occupancy means do not propose your location here. In contrast, and so as we think about the process as it moves through, many of these requirements come into play also once a permit is reviewed through the 300 series in terms of what are the notices if an operation has been approved, when must they go out, and what information must be required in those. So again, just trying to kind of zoom us back out to the context, how 300 and series are complementary and also highly technical. So let's ask all the questions. Don't be shy, go big. We're here to help support you.
Let's take a break before we start asking questions. We've been going at it for an hour and 45 minutes. Let's return at 10:50 for about a 13-minute break, and then we'll get into questions for staff.
Thank you.
Welcome back, commissioners. Welcome back to our 148 participants. At this point, we have received from staff the staff report on the 400 series, and we now are in a place for commissioner questions to staff. In order to kind of keep this organized, I wanted to sort of discuss with commissioners how you want to do this. We got a lot of different information from a lot of different people on a lot of different topics. It might make some sense, and I just throw this out here, to go back through sequentially and sort of first see if we have any questions for Ms. Stanzik, followed by questions for Mr. Leonard, et cetera. But that's just one approach. Do commissioners have thoughts about how to move through the Q&A in an organized fashion?
That works for me.
All right, then let's do that. We have Ms. Stanzik in the house. I see her. Hi, Ms. Stanzik. We will first initiate with any questions that may arise for you from the staff report that you put together. Commissioner McGowan.
And sorry, now I'm trying to remember who did which pieces, so hopefully this is an appropriate question at this point in time, so we'll find out. I think based on some of the pre-hearing statements that there was a group that wanted to know if sundry notices could be posted and then commented on. And I'm guessing, how frequent are they used? Are they, would that even be feasible? Would it even be useful? And so I would like your feedback or your thoughts about that.
Sure, thank you. So we process thousands of sundry notices, and the ones that I would think someone might want to comment on would be those that are used to receive approval for modifications of an existing permit, whether it's the Form 2A for the location or the Form 2 for drilling a well. And staff looks at proposed changes and we decide whether it is a minor change that can be approved with a sundry, which means there is no comment, or if it's a substantive change, we require a new Form 2 or a new Form 2A in order to engage that whole process. So sundries are just used for minor things. It's staff discretion to determine if it's substantive or not. That's something that has been the way we practice approvals forever. And yes, I saw that feedback in the pre-hearing statements, and the decision is to continue with what we've been doing and to be careful in making that call. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Other questions for Ms. Stanzik? All right, Jane, you're off the hook easy this morning. You must have done a really good job of explaining yourself, because everyone totally understands everything and we have no further questions for you. Okay, turning to Mr. Leonard. Good morning, Mr. Leonard. Appreciate your presentation as well. Do we have questions for Mr. Leonard? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So one of the notes that I put down here, and I apologize because I've got a bunch of different notes and I'm not sure I wrote all the right rule numbers down, but my note says in 436C, it indicates that compliance would only be required upon request. And I guess my question is, what would trigger that request?
So this is the compliance with the notification rule in seismic operations. Typically that would be based on a complaint. If we had a complaint from the general public, anybody in the public that said they did not get notified, then that would drive that.
Mr. Chair, if I may add something to Mr. Leonard's response. To be clear, Commissioner Messner, compliance is always required. Operators always must comply with the rules. Providing documentation of that compliance to the commission staff, as Mr. Leonard is talking about, would only be upon request. So does that make sense? So operators don't have to submit that information in every case unless Mr. Leonard and his staff determine that it's necessary to get it in response to a complaint.
Yeah, and I acknowledge that's what it said in there. I think I was just reading my shorthand notes here, so I skipped over that point. So I do acknowledge that point. My second question is also around the seismic piece, and about notice. And so how do we notice potential impacts to wildlife resources? Because it was pretty clear how we noticed as far as impacts to people, public health, and welfare, but how do we work that with wildlife resources and notice in those situations where it may not be near a population center?
It's an interesting question. Director Murphy, you have any comments on that? I mean, BLM, notice would be given to BLM as the surface owner in those instances. But I mean, actually notifying wildlife, I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, wildlife would be like, do we require a consult from CPW, or, you know, what's the process for making sure that those wildlife resources are acknowledged and impacts and conditions of approval may be implemented?
Fair.
Yes, Director Murphy.
We aren't practicing our elk bugling. that's for sure. But the noise rule in particular does require coordination with CPW on certain aspects to protect it. It doesn't? Oh, sorry.
Oh.
I'm going to turn this over to Joel.
Director
apparently.
Murphy, turn this over to H8G Minor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner Messner, just to be clear, your question is about seismic activities, correct? Yes. So this gets into the distinction again between the 300 series and the 400 series. So the permitting of seismic activities, the actual permit process is in the 300 series, not in the 400 series that we're discussing today. So if you go look in the permitting process for seismic, which is in Rule 313, you can see that Rule 313B5 does require, as part of that permitting process, a plan or measures to protect and minimize impacts to wildlife resources developed in coordination with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. So that coordination to protect wildlife resources is part of the 300 series rules, not the 400 series.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Mr. Leonard, I had a question or two, and then I'll recognize Commissioner Nanjapa. If you read, so this has been an iterative process from the March draft to a draft in late June to the August draft. And having read all of the submittals from the initial, sort of initial party input to pre-hearing statements to responses to pre-hearing statements, it is evident that staff has had ongoing discussions with stakeholders on some of the issues in the 400 series. And so I'd like you and or staff to address that and inform our stakeholders and me and the other commissioners sort of, and I'll pick on noise to start with. So noise started in March, and then there was a June, and then there was an August, and there was grumblings and pre-hearing statements about where noise was. It seems like the grumblings have become less intense with the more later filings, but how has noise, as an example, become iterative and become better in terms of the stakeholder input and collaboration that has been ongoing? Can you sort of describe that process and sort of describe where you feel that we are currently with stakeholders with regard to the noise draft? And then I might also ask the same question about odor.
Sure, thank you, Chairman. And we can take this odor, noise, light, whichever one you want to look at. They're very technical issues, and they're very, very science-based issues. Most of the contention, I believe, in the beginning was measurement distances. The current rule simply gives two measurement distances: 350 feet from the noise source or 25 feet from a complainant's residence. As you can imagine, in some areas, trying to find a good point of compliance or a good point of measurement can be difficult when you have hundreds, if maybe not thousands, of impacted residents. So we had to come to a consensus of where those points of compliance, we call them points of compliance in the rule, would be, so that staff and the operator and whoever wants to take a measurement takes it at the same place and then works out from there. It becomes really more of a receptor-based rule, which again is difficult with noise. It's difficult because people think noise radiates in a perfect circle, and it does not. It travels in different ways. Odor is the same thing. It does not necessarily, just radiate out in a circle. It'll travel. Light's just a little bit different. The whole idea behind light is to knock down the brightness, and light is really difficult as it's something new to the commission, and I believe something really new to the industry. So we had to have several discussions on that just to get everybody up to speed on the science of that, if that helps. Muted.
I'm muted. Director Murphy or Attorney General Minor, do you want to sort of comment on, where the rule before us is today versus where it was in March, and the process by which you've gotten to a different rule, and also similarly some comment on what was the level of consensus in March versus what's the level of consensus today?
Thank you, Chair, for the question. It's been an incredible process on the 400 series in particular, I think for the reasons that Mike noted in terms of highly technical information, and stakeholders have come forward with technical information to make our rules better. Noise and odor and lighting are great examples. Greg talked a lot about 411, which has been like hours of people knocking their heads together to come up with solutions, trying to figure out the data, trying to figure out the mapping to make sure that we identify issues in a way that is consistent with restrictions on data sharing, but also gives operators a guidance about areas to avoid, right? That's the goal with the public water supply rules in particular. But it's a countless number of meetings. It's reviewing pre-hearing statements, and it is reflective of a huge amount of investment and time by our parties. So I think those are all the soft answers to your question, Chair, of how did we get there? Time, investment, and a commitment from our stakeholders. It's been pretty unreal to me from starting even as early as November last year, and maybe a little bit before, as people started talking about what needs to change, how does this need to change. And staff put a laundry list of items out in November to think about technical permitting processes, and those have been refined through the course of stakeholder input. I think local governments have been particularly instructive in some of the noise, odor, lighting, dust rules in particular. They have a lot of expertise in this arena, and so we've wanted to draw from them in refining the rules that we have in place on those topics and improving them fairly dramatically. In Jane's world, the spacing space, Jesus. For spacing, industry's been really instructive about how do we do this, how can we do this well, and how do we make sure that people have access, and we're continuing to protect mineral owners. We've had engagement from mineral owners on any number of issues. We heard from them yesterday. On Scott's issue, we've had to, sorry, I'm not being very precise, in the rules 429 and 430 in terms of how do we adequately capture meter information. We've worked through with the field team, field inspectors, the industry folks who are in the field, and then their kind of operations people to come up with rules that get the information that we need. And that has all been an iterative conversation. That one has taken place over the last few days. So I hope that gives some flavor of the amount of time people have invested in our process to help us solve problems and come to you with less contentious rules than where we started. If you look at November, when we put out the white paper, if you look at, first part of the year when we put out red, like kind of the straw dogs, when you look at what we noticed in March, staff's refined positions in June, and then what came out in August and what continues to evolve kind of even as of this week. So Joel, Chair, if that answers your question, we're happy to move on. At the same time, if you want probably more precision about A to B, I think AAG Minor might have some insights.
AAG Minor, do you have more particular insights, having received kind of the global answer from Director Murphy? And obviously I can ask questions of parties as they come up on this issue as well, but I do believe that there has been some consensus building around noise in particular, maybe around odors, certainly around public water system. And Mr. Duranlo, be ready, I'm going to ask you the exact same question when it gets to be your turn. But, Mr. Minor, do you have anything to add?
I would just add two things. I don't have anything to add to Mr. Leonard's excellent description of the really excellent work done by numerous stakeholders to improve the noise rules and make sure that they're implementable and protective. I think I'll make 2 points though. One is that this stakeholder process is reflective of what is required in the Colorado Administrative Procedure Act. Section 244103 subpart 2 does require engagement with stakeholders, and sometimes I think that gets referred to as the Colorado way of rulemaking, and that's what this is. This is really implementing that directive of the Administrative Procedure Act to get input from the stakeholders who have expertise and really develop a better set of rules, and staff complied with that provision of the APA, and you get to see the benefit of that hard work by staff and all the stakeholders who provided the input. The other thing I'll mention is many of the areas where stakeholders provided really valuable input that allowed staff to improve the rules are things you won't hear about today, things that staff didn't present about and things that staff really didn't need to talk about because staff was able to get the feedback from those stakeholders, build it into the draft rules, and achieved essentially consensus with those stakeholders. I'll just use one example. Staff received very valuable input from the Colorado Alliance of Mineral Owners, CAMRO, regarding some of the payment of proceeds rules in 429 and 430, and I believe reached a great resolution on that. And as a result, I believe CAMRO is not planning to present on the 400 series rules today. So I encourage you, as you look back at the red lines of the rules, as well as any member of the public who's looking at the red lines of the rules that have been made available, you'll see red lines in a lot of places that you're not necessarily hearing about. And I think many of those areas are reflective of that really great engagement that staff did with stakeholders to come to a better resolution on some really tough issues. That means there's a much narrower range of issues before you today.
So thank you for that answer, Mr. Minor. So the lack of attention to some rules perhaps shows some consensus around rules, and we don't want to lose that fact. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you bringing up the Administrative Procedures Act and how it asked for this sort of collaboration. Commissioners, if you can bear with, I have two more questions or lines of inquiry, and then we'll move around the table. Mr. Leonard, Mr. Minor, Ms. Murphy, this is for kind of all of you, but with regard to the sort of nuisance questions and noise, lights, odors, dust, et cetera, I heard from Mr. Leonard in his direct testimony that the rule calls for a lot of pre-planning. And so the rule speaks to plans around those. And I have two questions around that. One, as I looked at the witness testimony and pre-hearing statements and responses to pre-hearing statements, industry in particular sort of noted that a lot of that's difficult to know at the stage in which the permits are being applied for. Like a lot of that's going to be dependent upon what rig is used, or the lights may be different depending upon, the equipment that's being used. And but I also recognize and note in the rules that we're asking for this pre-planning. Can you speak to the balance of trying to acknowledge the concerns from industry that some of that information is not knowable or will be more defined later on as they get closer to development or doing some action, versus the pre-planning and the need for information up front to make determinations of approvability? Director Murphy, do you want to lead?
I do. I think that we have provided some provided some guidance on that. I don't know if this is better for Joel to tackle first or Mike, but I'm kind of like making eye contact awkwardly with them on to figure that out.
So I may be able to help a little bit here. We do understand right now, and we have talked with stakeholders, that there's going to be an incredible amount of guidance put out on this. And that was one of the points that was brought up while we were working through the noise issue, the noise rulemaking is, yeah, we're not sure which rig we're going to have. But the plans can be implemented into the permits saying, for instance, with noise, we plan on putting up 32-foot sound walls. We'll be on electrical grid power, whatever that is. And then as it gets nearer to the completion or nearer to the start of operations date, they may have to amend that permit, much like Ms. Stanzik said, with the Form 4, putting the exact plan in. We left it kind of open to, for instance, in the odor rules, where we suggested some best management practices. Some municipalities have actually specified a specific fluid to be used. We didn't want to narrow that down, because then later on, when a better fluid comes along or a better technology comes along, you won't be able to use it because you've called it out in rule. So I hope that helps answer that question. We just want to be able to be flexible, because nuisance is just that. It's a nuisance. For instance, I went to CDPHE's odor school, which sounds odd at the very beginning, but you go to their school and the first thing they tell you is, nuisance is kind of in the eye of the beholder, because what about the person that lives next to the bakery that can't stand the smell of baking bread? So that's why we have to try and be flexible with what we have. And we do understand that at times permits are probably going to have to be changed or modified a bit to improve upon that nuisance impact. If that helps.
Attorney General Minor, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll give you the lawyerly version of what Mr. Leonard said, if that's all right, which is that if you look in subpart A in each of the nuisance rules, so 423, 424, 426, 427, those are the plans, right? And so you'll see in a lot of those rules, you see words like preliminary, estimated, proposed, anticipated, and that all recognizes exactly what Mr. Leonard was saying, that sometimes operators are submitting plans for locations that might not be developed for a while, and the exact details of where every single light fixture is going to be located might change over time. The goal of the plans is to encourage operators, as Mr. Leonard said, to come up with an idea of how they are going to structure their operations to comply with the substantive standards that are found in the rest of the rules, right? In subparts B through F in most of them. And there may be changes over time, but that pre-planning is just a crucial tool for the commission staff to work with operators, to work with local government partners, to work with sort of everyone involved in coming up with how should this operation work in order to comply with the substantive standards. Does that help?
That does. And yeah, one follow-up, and then I'll turn to Commissioner Gonzalez. I apologize for monopolizing the time. With regard to that, the subset A, the plans, and noting that we've received stakeholder comment that these areas are also areas in which local governments are actively involved. Is there an opportunity in Rule 422, which sort of sets the stage, or in the Statement of Basis and Purpose? I guess what I would like to contemplate is, if a operator has gone to the local government, and we've talked about the collaboration in the 300 series, and we're going to be more involved at the local government stage, and we've got to develop all that up once we get all this in place. But if they've done that, and if they've generated plans for the local government in these areas, could we do what we did in the 300, which is, if there are plans, the operator can submit those plans to commission as sort of the substantially equivalent sort of thing that was in the 300, and do an analysis before we make them do it over or do it again or do it differently, to determine whether those plans might be acceptable to meet the tenets of the rules for this pre-planning. And I sort of throw that out to the group as a whole.
Mr. Chair, I can try responding if that's all right. So this is exactly what the substantially equivalent information provision in Rule 304E is all about. So each of these plans, the details of what should be in the plan is specified in the 400 series, but each plan is a required component of a Form 2A in Rule 304C. And so you are absolutely correct that if a local government also requires an operator to submit, say, an odor plan or a noise plan or a light plan, and that plan substantively meets the requirements of the Commission's rules in the 400 series, the operator could submit that local government plan as substantially equivalent information pursuant to Rule 304E as part of their Form 2A application. And then Mr. Geronlo's team would take a look at those plans and ensure that it does meet the Commission's requirements. But yes, that is an excellent opportunity for local government collaboration and for the Commission staff to continue its productive working relationship with local governments, to learn from them and learn from their best practices about how they address these nuisance issues. I would also note that several of the specific rules, I believe 423B and 424B, whenever there's a land use designation involved, for example, setting a noise standard in a residential area versus an agricultural area, as Mr. Leonard discussed earlier, the Commission isn't doing land use planning, so the Commission staff will rely on the local government zoning for that. And of course, local governments have the opportunity under the rules to provide additional input about sort of what the appropriate zoning consideration should be. So if they have something that they have zoned as light commercial, but in their mind, that really means agricultural. They can come in and make sure that the appropriate zoning standard is sort of applied. And there's opportunities for consultation there throughout the Form 2A review process.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. We may want to tuck something like that into the statement and basis and purpose. We'll now turn to other commissioners. I think Commissioner Nanjapa, you had your hand up a while ago, and so I'm going to turn to you first, and then we'll get through all commissioners. Commissioner Nanjapa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If Commissioner Gonzalez had a follow-up on that particular topic, I can throw it to him because mine is kind of going backwards.
Okay. Commissioner Gonzalez, were you segueing off of this topic?
I was. I have kind of a quick follow-up in regards to kind of a avoidance of redundancy, avoidance of unnecessary sundries and forms going across the commission's desk. I was curious if the plans as envisioned by staff would allow for if-then type planning. For instance, if we use X, horsepower rig or X, combustion type rig versus Y, whatever. If we move our pad, from here to there, or we put our lights from this place to the next place. Anyways, could they envision multiple scenarios that, if they were all applicable and in conformance with the rules and the statute, would that be an acceptable plan? Even though it's not a specific plan for I will do X, Y, and Z, it's more of an if-then setup. I'm curious if there's room for that.
Chairman.
Mr. Leonard, Mr. Minor, Mr. Dronlow.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this, and I appreciate that because it really does come to, how our oil and gas location assessment specialists, review the plans and make sure that they are something that can be implemented. One of the things we really look for in those plans is how a decision is going to be made to direct a change. For example, if an operator says, we're going to put sound walls on the north and east sides of a property, and our review says, well, there's some homes, a good ways out on the south side, how will you make that decision as to whether additional sound mitigation is necessary on the south side? And so we will work with the operator to understand how those types of decisions are made to essentially to better comply with the rules, or in some cases just to comply with the rules. But so that's that description of how the decisions get made is a really key component.
Thank you, Mr. Dronlow. Did others want to field this question?
If I may, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Leonard.
And I do think that the scenario, Commissioner, that you envision of, I'm not sure which rig I'm going to use. It's going to be either this one or that one. Yeah, I think that can be put into the plan. And if I use this rig, then I will do this. And that speaks to Mr. Dronlow's, how are you going to get it done, right? If I use that rig, then I'll do this. I think that would be an acceptable plan, as long as in the end you used one of those two rigs, if that helps.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard. Mr. Gonzalez, did you have follow-up?
No, I think that's pretty clear. It sounds like that if there's realistic scenarios and those scenarios are contemplated on the front end and the appropriate mitigations are contemplated in conjunction with those, that could be an acceptable submission with the overall plan. If I'm wrong about that, someone jump in and let me know.
Everybody waving their heads back and forth like this, that means you're not wrong. Okay, Commissioner Nanjapa, moving to a different line of inquiry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I wanted to just follow up on the question that Commissioner Messner asked related to wildlife resources, and I appreciate the clarification that the consult would happen in the permitting phase in the 300 series, I think you said. Related to that, would there be the opportunity for notice for some of the other interested groups in terms of the email lists that we discussed yesterday? Sort of that idea that groups can opt in and be informed, and would they be included in these types of notices so that if there was an area that maybe they were more familiar with respect to a wildlife issue, they would have the opportunity to perhaps engage in the issue? And I guess a related question is, if there is a concern among the folks who are noticed what happens then?
Sure, I can try
Attentional
to.
minor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the Form 20 is an example of an administrative permit. So it does not go to the commission to review. That's the seismic permitting. So it would not be in the category there's an email list for. That's just for commission review permits like oil and gas development plans. So those seismic operations are just the ones that Ms. Stanzik and Mr. Leonard discussed last week and today, that are for essentially bringing the, oh my gosh, I can't say this word, Vibroceus trucks out to do the sort of preliminary bounce back waves. And so that is, given its sort of relatively temporary nature, it's not a permit that staff have proposed to go to the commission for review. So it would not be part of the hearings email list. There are, of course, opportunities again for things like consultation with state agencies built into Rule 313 governing seismic permitting, opportunities for local government permitting as well that might bring in impacted citizens. But on the permitting side, there sort of isn't a public comment built into those Form 20s as currently structured. However, for people who do live nearby, that is the purpose of Rule 436, the operational standards, of ensuring that anyone who is actually close to where this location is happening or where the operation is happening receives adequate notice. That, as Mr. Leonard mentioned, gives an opportunity perhaps for iterative dialogue with the operator and with the commission staff. So if those people who live near where the operation was occurring did have concerns and sort of specific knowledge about wildlife in the area, there could be an opportunity to raise it once they got that notice under Rule 436 when the operation was happening. I don't know how well that answers your question, and perhaps Mr. Leonard, who's much more familiar with the details of that notice, may have a little more to add about sort of what that notice under 436 entails.
Commissioner Nanjapa, follow-up?
I do, but if Mr. Leonard wanted to add, I'm happy to listen to that first before I ask further questions.
Yeah, and I think it's as Mr. Minor stated, it goes out to the surface owners, to every surface owner in that project area. So it's not just the nearby surface owners; it's every surface owner in that project area. And you have to keep in mind that these projects, they can be large, as I stated in my presentation. You know, a 25 square mile project is not really that big of a project. It can go into the hundreds of square miles.
Commissioner,
okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I did, again, just following up on what Commissioner Messner had asked. So in that instance, so I'm understanding there's that differentiation again with the permitting. There's a consult that happens with CPW, but there isn't a notice in the permitting. So this is the notice when there's actually going to be the seismic testing that's going to happen. And so it goes to the local areas, but what about those entities that might want to take some action to mitigate impacts on wildlife? You know, perhaps there's a seasonal consideration or, you know, something else that's happening right at that time and they would prefer that the seismic testing is delayed, or, and so that leads again to that other part of my question of when a concern is raised, then what happens?
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Minor.
So Commissioner Nanjapa, I think that is really the purpose of the Colorado Parks and Wildlife consultation in Rule 313b4. Wildlife is a challenging issue because the wildlife can't speak for themselves. And so you'll see a lot of places in the Commission's rules, there's sort of a built-in assumption that Colorado Parks and Wildlife is the best entity to speak on behalf of those wildlife. And so there is the purpose of that consultation really is to develop best practices, protect wildlife, think about seasonal timing restrictions, et cetera. You'll also notice that in Rule 313b1, high priority habitat is mapped. So there's a general sense of where this is happening. And I think if there are ideas that the Commission wishes to direct staff about receiving input about wildlife issues from entities that other than Colorado Parks and Wildlife, certainly that is your prerogative as commissioners to provide further direction there. But as it stands, Staff is relying on our sister agencies and the really highly qualified experts at Colorado Parks and Wildlife to provide the input that would be needed to develop appropriate protections for wildlife in the course of the Form 20 seismic permitting.
Commissioner Najapa?
Thank you, AG Minor. Yeah, I think that I'll just sort of pin this, for additional discussion, but I think there's a somewhat of a difference between sort of thinking about the overall, duration of an operation and the consult there in terms of the location, and sort of high impact, moment in time, like with the seismic testing that could have an impact on various wildlife populations, and again, especially in seasonal instances. And so that might be something to consider in terms of the notice. And then I guess I'm not sure that I have a clear answer on what happens if a concern is raised among those who are noticed.
Director Murphy?
Thank you. Sorry, frantically trying to find unmute. Commissioner Najapa, we do really rely on CPW and their expertise when it comes to determining what the best avoidance, minimization, mitigation measures are when it comes to wildlife. I think that there are lots of other sources of information, right, that are also credible, deeply experienced, and I think a number of those folks are also in coordination and in close communication with CPW. But in terms of us trying to evaluate the best path forward, it's our partnership with CPW when it comes to wildlife recommendations. And I think that we've had collaborative conversations with CPW and key stakeholders. I think Mr. Beauvais is one of them, right? And he talked to us quite a bit yesterday about his work in the field. And I mean, he's been an integral part of conversations over the last year or two with a number of with us and CPW to try to understand the sources of information. And when we were putting together the rules, and this is kind of treading outside of the 400 series, to me, it has been important to us and to CPW to understand that their role in consult is driven by the location of wildlife, not by a map that may not be as current, right? We want to use the maps to guide engagement, but if something changes on the ground, that's why we do on-sites, that's why we do kind of the field level observation. That's why so much of the information that comes in looks at the real-time data so that we can make informed decisions. But we do really rely on our partnership in terms of evaluating what the best mitigation measures, minimization measures, or avoidance measures are to protect wildlife.
And Mr. Chair, if I may add on to that just a little bit, in terms of incorporating feedback about non-wildlife issues, obviously there are concerns that don't go to wildlife, right? Like one of the major impacts, potential impacts of seismic operations, as Mr. Leonard and Ms. Danzig have discussed, is traffic impacts and potential road closures or more trucks on a road. There are two rules that are really specifically intended to address that. One is 436A1C, and there's a reason that the operator needs to provide their phone number and their contact information to every potentially impacted resident, and that's so that the residents can reach out to the operator directly and have that dialogue. You'll also notice in Rule 436B2, that's the utility owner consult that Mr. Leonard mentioned, and the staff recognize that those utilities are really important entities to know about what's going on so they can make sure there's not potential unintended consequences to other underground infrastructure. And that consult piece does sort of incorporate that the operator needs to actually speak to the utility owner and sort of incorporate concerns as necessary. And then if we have time, maybe Mr. Leonard can just give a little more detail on what it's like on the staff side in terms of how staff responds to potential complaints or questions that staff receives for either after a nearby resident receives the initial notice that seismic operations is going to occur before they happen, or complaints received while they're in process.
Sure,
Thank you, Mr. Minor. Mr. Leonard?
Thank you, Chairman. So we don't receive a great deal of complaints on these operations. The last one I can think of was in the Thornton area. And the problem there was operations began and there was not complete notice given. We actually had a member of staff living there at the time. I think he still lives there. And all of a sudden these trucks are going down the street, and he's, you know, why is this going on? Some of the other complaints that we receive are for foundational damage of houses. That's why we added the vibrational limits. Now, that being said, most of these, as we investigate most of these seismic survey projects that are near homes, they are putting out, and I'm going to use the wrong word here, but transducers that are actually measuring those vibrations and staying within the vibration limits that we have set in the rules to prove that they did not damage these foundations and other utilities, if that helps.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard. Any follow-up, Commissioner Nanjapa? And then we'll go to Commissioner Messner.
Thank you. Yeah, just briefly, I mean, I think I appreciate all of that information. That's really helpful. And I wanted to just acknowledge for the record that I fully understand and believe in the expertise within CPW as well. But, you know, I'm just thinking about this in terms of, you know, if there's a notice, like say 2 days before seismic testing is going to occur, and there's, you know, something that's a seasonal occurrence, you know, nesting or you know, other sort of reproductive activities that are happening among high priority wildlife in the area. And if I understood correctly, per your answer to Commissioner Messner, that in this instance of the notice of the testing, it would not go to CPW because that would have been part of the broader consultation prior. So I'm just trying to, you know, understand how the pieces fit together. And so I'm more just sort of stating that as a comment, and again, like, you know, potentially for more, just to pin that for more discussion later. But yeah, that's just something that I'm interested in as it relates to this idea that people can be noticed, but when we're trying to figure out how to address the concerns to wildlife, we've got some more complexities to handle.
Director Murphy?
I think one piece we have not brought forward around seismic and is very limited to the seismic situation is that seismic permits are good for 6 months. And so that duration, I think, helps us all focus on some of the concerns that you've identified, but obviously wildlife don't respect temporal geographic boundaries either. So, but I think that is one control mechanism in place or in the proposed rules.
All done, Commissioner Nanjapa? Okay. Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa, for kind of following this line of questioning a little further. And I'm going to agree with you about kind of maybe wanting to put a flag in this. And I need to do a little further analysis and remind myself the coordination between the 300 series permitting process in this particular situation. But I do know from personal experience that seismic operations, you know, in the Western Slope, in more remote areas can actually last for quite long periods of time, and, you know, have operations that include dropping equipment off with helicopters and utilization of shot holes. And, you know, I think it does have the potential to really make some significant impacts to wildlife. And so I think making sure that our process does ensure that we're, you know, taking the time to truly evaluate what those impacts are, and making sure that we're nailing those operations, because certainly, you know, the situation in Thornton is significantly different than, you know, in the North Fork Valley or you know, somewhere in the Piceance Basin. And so I think that I would like to just flag that. So.
I'm muted. Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Other questions for commissioners well, we were kind of doing this to Mr. Leonard, but it's kind of opened back up. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I apologize if I'm taking us backwards, and I need this clarified in my brain. So I submit my oil and gas development plan, and it has Form 2A. And attached to the Form 2As are all of these nuisance plans. Noise, light, dust, traffic, right? And that is my opportunity as a community member to see what an operator has planned, or a local government. And I am allowed to give feedback during public comment and hearings on those pieces, or no?
Director Murphy?
May I ask, in the sentence, your question was operator submits plans, plans go out to review, and then local governments engage through consultation, CDPHE or CPW as appropriate, to provide feedback on those plans, and the public through the public comment portal or public comment periods is how we receive.
Okay, so what I'm trying to clarify is that I, as a community member, have an opportunity to see those plans because they're attachments to the 2A. I get to see them, and I have an opportunity to view it and to comment on it. And then my follow-up question to that, I feel like some of the feedback that we've gotten is, and maybe concerns around the sundry notice. If I think, I'm going to make this up, if I think the noise plan looks like A and it's using Y type of equipment and compliance testing places in Z and A areas, and then I, as a community member, think that's what this is going to look like, and then the operator gets in there and that's not exactly what they're going to do. They're going to use a different type of machine or whatever. I'm totally making this up. But then me as a community member, I'm like, that's not what was promised in this plan. And I'm just trying to figure out what is that kind of feedback for someone. I was expecting this, but then what I really got was this. And so wanting to know that people know up front what's going to be in the plan, and there's an opportunity to provide feedback or input. And then afterwards, once it's been approved, assurances that we're not using the sundry notice to change an expectation that I might have as a community member for any of these attached plans. I hope this is making sense what I'm asking.
Director Murphy.
Thank you, sorry, Chair. Commissioner McGowan, I think it's an important question, and I think it delves back into the 300 series in terms of how do we evaluate changes to permits. And it's really important to understand that process to manage the concerns that you've articulated. In how we have characterized it in 301C is if there is a significant change to an approved permit, we need to have a new permit filed. And so I'm kind of free-forming this, so I'm sure my team may jump in to refine or overrule anything that I say, but what that means to me is if we take an example that we walked through with Commissioner Gonzalez where there were a couple of options explored. Those are both part of the plan, those both could be implemented. If we came in with an extremely concrete plan that was extremely prescriptive about how a particular impact were going to be mitigated or minimized, and that was exactly verbatim what was approved, and that wasn't working, we would need to evaluate what the proposed corrective measure needed or different mitigation solution would need to come in, whether it's a significant change. If it's a significant change, it needs to be re-permitted, right? Our goal, our performance-based standards, like here are the rules that you need to achieve. Tell us how you're going to achieve them. And if what you've proposed isn't achieving them, we have a really big problem. So I'm not sure that perfectly answers on all squares your question, but that to me is the process, is if we need to deviate from what has been approved to achieve compliance, and that's a significant change, it needs to come to the commission on a new permit or permit revision.
Commissioner McGowan, follow up? Or one of our other panelists would like to speak, Mr. Duranlo.
Yeah, Chairman, if I may, and I think Mr. Leonard gave a great example about changes on the fly with respect to drilling mud and odor issues with the drilling mud, and then the director working with the operator to make some changes to that drilling mud program. We never want to sort of curtail the ability to make improvements on a site in a rapid and responsive manner. And so we would want changes such as that to be documented in a Form 4 that says, well, they said they were going to do it this way, but after a few inspections, we made changes to the program and used a different mud. That gets it documented. We wouldn't want that to necessarily have to stop operations and come to the commission for something that is making an improvement. And in fact, we've had this program in place, or this process in place of considering changes on a pad for quite some time, and we've used guidance around the word substantive changes. And where we've applied that is when we've received a Form 4 or a notice, that says, hey, a question from an operator, hey, we're going to make a change. Do we need to file anything? We would review that and say, does this change have the potential to increase impacts to a nearby receptor? Then it's probably substantive. It needs to be a heightened level of documentation. If the operator is coming to us and say, hey, we found out that we can move this site 500 feet further away from that neighborhood, we're going to try and help that process out. And that's how we've done that in the past. And I think we want to make sure that we're allowing changes that minimize impacts to happen, while making sure that we're reviewing for a change that could potentially increase impacts. And those would obviously be the ones that need to be reviewed by the commission. So we will have further guidance on Rule 301C, but that's a little perspective on how staff deals with that information when it comes in the door.
Thank you, Mr. Duranlo. Commissioner Messner, and then Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I wonder, and it may very well be in there, but when so we've got the initial plan and understand that it is a proposed plan, and this is a performance-based planning process where there's a lot of different techniques to get to the same outcome. The outcome is obviously, what the goal is. And so I wonder if there's not some language in there, or if we could include some language that would say that, if the modified plan is equal or more protective than the conceptual plan or the initial plan was, then the sundry notice could be utilized. If it is not, then or is a substantial change, then it would go to a new application process. So I wonder if anyone can give, maybe that language is already there and I'm missing it.
Director Murphy.
Candidly, I probably need a little bit of time to think through how that would work, unless AEG Minor wants to chime in.
Attorney General Minor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So Commissioner Messner, there's not language in the proposed rules that would do what you suggested. Staff could certainly explore that if that is the Commission's direction, as Director Murphy said. I think what's important to bear in mind is that maybe this question in some ways, in I think staff's view, is subsumed by sort of a bigger picture question of how this all works, right? So the plans are new. There were not, the 800 series rules addressing nuisance issues that currently exist. Those have existed for a long time. Operators have always had to comply with the Commission's nuisance standards. So the plans are a new tool that staff have developed to help operators plan in advance with how they're going to comply with those substantive standards. And as Mr. Leonard discussed, that presents numerous benefits. However, the bigger issue is that operators, of course, do still need to comply with all of the substantive standards that are really the focus of the 400 series, everything about each of those nuisance issues. And so, I think it's less of a question of changing a plan and more a question of, in practice, is the operator hitting the decibel limits they need to hit? In practice, is the operator mitigating odors to the extent necessary that they need to? In practice, is the operator using the appropriate dust suppression techniques that they meet the substantive standards of Rule 427? And so I think staff generally frames this, and this is why you're hearing about it from Mr. Leonard, as a compliance issue, not so much we need you to file lots and lots of paperwork to tell us about every single change to your plan. The real question is, can you put together a good enough plan to show that you know how you're going to comply with the rules? And then in practice, are you going to comply with them? And that's why Mr. Leonard and the compliance team and the Commission's field inspectors are really the ones who are overseeing and making sure that that compliance occurs. So I don't know if Director Murphy or Mr. Leonard has more to add to that, but hopefully that helps you understand how staff framed the question.
I'm not seeing either Director Murphy or Mr. Leonard unmuting themselves, so you must have done a good job there. Did you have follow-up on that, Commissioner Messner, or can I turn to Commissioner Gonzalez?
No, I'm finished. Thank you.
Commissioner Gonzalez, I can't remember if you raised your hand or not.
I did not. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Further questions for this panel from commissioners? Okay. Commissioner Messner, followed by Commissioner Nanjapa.
So I guess I was unsure as far as this panel. Are we talking about the full 400 series here, or just the folks that we've called on so far?
I'm not sure either. I know we need to have discussion with Mr. Dronlow, Mr. Cuthbertson, Mr. Andrews. So maybe we'll just move to Mr. Andrews at this point and see if we have questions for him. So let's go there. Hello, Dave. Good to see you. Do folks have questions for Mr. Andrews relevant to his testimony? Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this was Mr. Andrews' presentation. It may have also been some of it covered in Mr. Leonard's presentation, but there was, in the summary of wellbore integrity and the rulemaking there, and also just kind of thinking about the location of wells. I think you mentioned well-to-well communication, and if I understood that correctly, that was especially in hydraulic fracking operations, ensuring that there's not sort of a transmission of fluids or anything between the different wells or potentially to the groundwater. And so I just wanted maybe a little bit of more explanation and clarification on that. And then in general, I don't know if this would be better in sort of a separate conversation, but I just wanted to better understand sort of how you are able to avoid those existing wells. Is it just from the specific mapping that's occurring, or what are the processes that you can sort of route, the horizontal wells around those existing vertical wells? So this is just more of a question from ignorance of not knowing how these things work and wanting to understand.
So to address, thank you, Chair. So to address the first part of the question, the well-to-well communication or frac hits, normally we're talking about if a producing zone is stimulated and there's other operator wells that are also completed in that same zone, is the potential for the pressure from one hydraulically fractured well to communicate with that other offset well, and to essentially make sure that the operator of that offset well, whether it's the same operator that's hydraulically fracturing or a different operator that's nearby, is aware of the operation and monitoring pressures and ensuring that if there is what's called a frac hit, that the surface equipment on the offset wellhead is equipped to withstand that pressure, or that there are downhole plugs set in that offset well, if they didn't go to the trouble of changing out the surface equipment. And then, I'm sorry, the second part of the question.
The second part of the question was, I was just trying to understand sort of what is the process that you undertake to avoid existing wells. Like if you're routing, the horizontal well around a vertical well, how does that work? Or is that, what is that process? Is it with sort of, what is that process? I'm not even going to speculate. But I just want to understand.
So for horizontal wells, it really comes down to part of the submittal that the operator provides. So they are required to look 1,500 feet out from their wellbore to all surrounding wellbores, offset wells, and conduct an evaluation. So they have to look at the well files for those offset wells, determine which formations are isolated, which formations may not be isolated, and then they have to develop a mitigation strategy. So all of that comes in with the permit right now, and then our engineers review that well by well, check our records versus what the operator is saying. So, sometimes if it's in an area that hasn't been developed much, you may only be looking at 1 or 2 offset wells. In the heart of Wattenberg, where there is a lot of development, there are dozens of wells potentially within that 1,500 foot buffer of the wellbore that our engineers have to evaluate, review those offset wells. So in a sense, it's not just reviewing one well, it's reviewing the entire system of wells around that proposed well.
Follow up, Commissioner. Other questions for Mr. Andrews, Mr. Messner, or Commissioner Messner?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I do want to compliment you on the graphics. That was actually the best visual of how the operations work that I've seen to date, and so I really appreciate that. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
That's no reflection on your graphics, Mr. Geronimo.
No, it actually was.
Do we have other questions for Mr. Andrews? Seeing none, does anyone have questions for Mr. Cuthbertson on his presentation? That was pretty straightforward. Hello, Scott, good to see you, but I don't think we have any questions for you. Okay, questions for Mr. Geronimo. I'd like to start here, and you probably saw this coming, Mr. Geronimo, but similar to the question that I had for the previous panelist about development of the rules and their iterative process that has taken place. I do know that there has been a lot of work, and in fact, you recognized right up front some of the stakeholders that were involved in development of the Public Water System Supply Rule. And in fact, as I reviewed all the information around the Public Water System Supply Rule, I actually had to go print off a clean version of it because it was redlined so much that it was difficult to follow, and that's not the case with a lot of the other rules. And I think that is a testament to the amount of work that went into it. I just want to give you an open-ended ability to respond, to tell the world the work that went into the Public Water System Rule, where it started, how it got to where it's at and where it's at now, how much of consensus was there at the beginning versus the consensus that's there now. So that's kind of a open-ended softball to further frame the work that has gone into this really important rule.
Well, thank you very much for the question, Chairman. And you've stated it correctly. I mean, that red line is testament to how much effort and work went into that process. The stakeholders have been engaged with COGCC since long before this rulemaking. We've been meeting with water providers along a stretch of river called the South Beebe Draw by Bar Lake Reservoir for a couple of years, and looking for ways to protect their water system with nearby oil and gas development. That's led to some productive consultations with various operators. That's led to some butting of heads with various parties as well. So, you know, we've known about this issue. Also, I would point to the city of Brighton, who came to us, you know, several years ago and worked with a specific order of the commission to protect their water system due to some unique circumstances about their water sources, both wells and surface water supplies. So we've drawn on all of that to put this together. And I think, you know, I feel strongly that we've arrived in a really good place. As we, you know, bringing from 317B to 411, bringing in the Goody wells, you know, was I won't say a straightforward step, but it was an obvious big step to take. As we tried to bring in the type 3 wells and figure out what type of protection would be appropriate for them, that's where in drafting the rules, we sort of felt like it came unraveled a bit. And that's where we really stepped back and said, what do these rules need to do, and how do they need to do it? And that's where we completely blew up the whole structure of the rules and reorganized it into just talking about how we're treating each one of those public water sources. And that's, I mean, that's the source of a lot of that red line, is we completely changed the structure of the rules so it was much more straightforward to read, to understand, for both operators understanding how they're going to engage with the rules, and public water system providers to understand how the rules protect them. And then, you know, moving on from there, working in the protections and making sure that our Goody well protections were appropriate due to the risks that those water sources face, and that our type 3 water protections were appropriate given their unique circumstances. I think the consultation provision has been a really strong section in there, that now when an operator comes in, they do have the responsibility to connect and make that relationship with the public water system provider and develop a program that the water provider is comfortable with and the operator is capable of implementing. So, I mean, a lot of work went into it. The parties I named before, and there's many that I didn't name, but you know, really just it was good to see everyone stepping up. We've still got some red lines that are circulating behind the scenes, and so we're still working on that to make sure that, you know, if there's anything we can do to turn a screw and make something better, we should do that. So still working through that.
Thank you for that, Mr. Dronlo. Do we have other questions from commissioners for Mr. Dronlo and his testimony?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Dronlo, you mentioned that between 2014 and 2019, there were 40 spills, I believe you said, that impacted surface waters. And then I think you made the comment, I just want to make sure I understood correctly, that this represented 1% of all spills. Is that in Colorado or broader?
Yes, thank you for the question. So that is Colorado data. And so roughly 4,000 spills over that time period. And I did very back of the envelope math to get to the 4,000 and the 1%. But the 40 spills is the accurate number.
Thank you. Follow up, Commissioner?
Sorry, just what last bit, I believe you also said, I just want to make sure this was correct, that in those instances, and just was it some proportion of those 40 or all of them where you observed impacts beyond that original 300-foot distance?
No, so those are definitely two separate subsets of spills. I should point out that the 40 spills is also a fairly conservative number because many of those were reported as spills to water, even if it was affected a dry drainage that was tributary to a creek. So that's not necessarily 40 spills that had, you know, direct impacts to surface water. With respect to, and I apologize, I've lost my train of thought on the second part of your question. So, or maybe your second question that I failed to answer so far.
No, thank you. I was asking, you had mentioned about impacts beyond 300 feet, and I'm curious, you know, what proportion of those spills, you know, you noticed that?
So I didn't run an evaluation on all 4,000 of those spills to see how far they traveled. I did look in that one example surface water supply area, you know, where I said I think there were 12 spills reported. I did click through all of those and see if I could determine how far all of them went, and I did find one that had traveled across pretty hard ground and went 550 feet. Most of them stayed on the pad. Another one of them traveled off the pad, and many of them stayed within the secondary containment. It's not really a data point that gets entered into a form. How far does the spill travel? So it's not something we can readily query. It does require, you know, opening up each spill and reading the description of it.
Thank you for that answer. Did you have further follow-up? Okay. Other commissioners for this witness? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Duran, though, well done, particularly on the 411 rules. I mean, really, really great stuff. I did have a question about the chemical prohibition, which I think is to me a no-brainer. And so these chemicals are prohibited within, well, depending on the application in different areas. So I guess just from a technical standpoint, what do operators utilize if they're not utilizing these chemicals that would be less impactful? I guess so. I'm wondering what other options are available to operators, because certainly looking at the table of the chemical additives in 411-1, you know, there's some pretty nasty stuff on that, and I do know that some local jurisdictions are actually, I think, utilizing a similar list of chemicals and just not allowing the utilization of those in general within their jurisdiction. And so my question is if operators are not using these, what are they using?
And thank you for that question. It's my understanding, and this is mostly from talking with Mike Leonard and Dave Andrews, that you know, those chemicals are not necessarily at the forefront of what operators are using today. However, I can't say that I'm, you know, the right expert to answer the question about what operators are using, and perhaps industry representatives might be able to speak to that a little bit better. But certainly it's our understanding, and based on, for example, Adams County has banned that same list of chemicals. It's our understanding that, you know, operators can work around that.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think that's something that that I'll be noodling on as we go through this series, is whether or not, if it is, you know, if it is viable, and industry is understanding that some best management practices may be to eliminate the utilization of these chemicals, whether or not the prohibition of some of these chemicals may be expanded into future applications. So something I'm noodling on right now. So just a heads up on that one.
And Chair, if I may,
Yes.
just to follow up on that, you know, we did propose it out to the 1,500 feet from, you know, the public water source. That's, you know, our starting point. I think certainly some stakeholders expressed a desire to have it statewide. Some our public water suppliers probably would have preferred it out to the full half mile on those. And so, you know, I think there is a specific reason to prohibit those around a sensitive and vulnerable public water source. I think that's very appropriate. And so that was, you know, essentially where we started was that 1,500 feet buffer.
Thank you, Mr. Geronimo. Other questions for Mr. Geronimo? Thank you very much, Greg. Great work. Really appreciate the dedicated effort. I know that was a lot of work, and we're not there, and we're going to be hearing from all the stakeholders about the work that's happened to date, but I think you've got it in a really good spot for Coloradans to deliberate this really important topic. So thank you, and thank you to the stakeholders.
Thanks, and I'll try and improve my graphics next time.
I don't know, you're following Andrews. Is that our last witness, Director Murphy? I'm looking.
Sorry, I can't find unmute again. We are here for you all day, every day. So if that kind of wraps up the chunk of questions you have right now for staff, I think that that's all we had to present to you about 400 series this morning. I, of course, don't have Mimi's revised agenda at the forefront of my brain right now, but I kind of think we're supposed to go to lunch.
Yeah, the agenda has a lunch break at 12:10, and look at this, it's 12:10. So again, we are on schedule, and we were supposed to break until 1, and then we'll start hearing from our parties, starting with Industry Group 1, 400 series only, and then Industry Group 2. So let's follow our agenda. We're on time. Great work, everybody. And we will dismiss ourselves from Zoom and for 50 minutes and return at 1 o'clock.